this was the incident that I reported about, a very, very dramatic sighting. Well, let me describe what I'm going to try to do. For the first third or half of my presentation, I'm going to present to you some of the most dramatic sightings that have been reported to me and to the National UFO Reporting Center over the last 21 years, and even going back further than that. Last time, some of you who were here, you will note that I touched on these 4 cases, and I'm going to go through those very quickly. And I got to the Phoenix Lights event, and I ran out of time. I had a 90-minute span 4 years ago, and I got to the Phoenix Lights at 85 minutes into that 90 minutes. So I'm going to rip through these cases, and then I'm going to talk about the 4 cases that I had prepared that I didn't get to. So I mention that so you're not shocked by how fast I'm going through these slides. And you may say, actually, Jerry said I have 90,000 cases. There are really 105,988 cases in my database. I have that database with me, and I know that because I looked at the number just before I left Eastern Washington on Thursday morning. And about 90% of those are posted to our website. The others are hoaxes and frivolous reports and really not worth posting at all. But you may wonder, how did I distill 106,000 cases down to 8 or so? And these are the criteria I use. I am a scientist. For me, the only thing that counts is data, not opinion, not long-winded descriptions, not assurances. None of that matters to me. What I want to know is, did you get a photograph? Are there multiple witnesses? And so on. Well, the criteria I used are, was it a dramatic event? Were there multiple independent witnesses? Were all the witnesses recounting the same thing? Do we have objective evidence like photographs or video? And that's going to be the closing portion of my show. And was an investigation conducted subsequent to the sighting or the event? Those are the criteria I've used to winnow down 106,000 cases down to 8. Now, if I get through those 8 cases, then the second major subject I'm going to be talking about is a phenomenon that started just 3 years ago this month. If probably many of you have heard me on radio, Jeff Rentz or the Coast to Coast program. You've heard me talk about those red fireballs. If I talk about them anymore, I think George Norrie is going to fire me. But it is the most compelling, most frequent phenomenon that is taking place in the reports that come to me on a regular basis. Then, and I've highlighted this in red, whereas my discussion of the cases may be the most entertaining for you, it is by no means, in my opinion, the most important. What you don't or may not understand is the question of whether UFOs are visiting our planet or not has been resolved, and you don't know it yet. I'm going to show you what the system is that will start giving us really objective data, that will take away, will wrest from the claws of our government the monopoly of information about the UFO phenomenon. I've been talking about this for 20 years, and I haven't seemed to catch people's attention, but I've prepared an all-new presentation about it. I'll have a few concluding remarks, and I'll close, if I get through all of this, with a few concluding remarks about a most amazing coincidence. I hope you enjoy it if I get there, and then we'll have Q&A. Well, a few questions I always am struggling with, and they're questions that UFO investigators like me have to resolve, and they are, as you see before you. First of all, do astronomers see UFOs? Well, I have a few slides here that will introduce you to the evidence that suggests they do. Also, does the government know about UFOs? Clearly they do. I suspect if we were to take a poll in this room, we would have, maybe even by acclamation, unanimity. The answer to that question is yes. Do we ever capture good photographs? Well, if I have time, I'll show you some interesting video. Do UFOs ever have mechanical malfunctions? Roswell is pretty good evidence of that, isn't it? I have another case that I presented last, 4 years ago. I'm going to go into it in a little greater depth. And if UFOs are real objects, how long have they been coming here? And then I'm going to, throughout this, I have 4 coincidences that have occurred in ufology that I think I have detected, and I'm going to share them with you. Well, this is a very interesting article, June 1960. This is a NASA published article written by Dr. John O'Keefe about an incident that occurred over Toronto, Ontario, February 9th, 1913, before the First World War. And a group of astronomers were outside at a barbecue, if they had barbecues in 1913. They were outside at night, and you can tell it's night because there is Orion, the 3 stars that form the belt of Orion, and that constellation is visible principally during the winter months. They saw groups of fireballs move across the sky very, very slowly. And it was so dramatic an event that one of those astronomers, the chairman of the astronomy department at the University of Toronto, did a painting. I had the pleasure of speaking in Toronto, Ontario last October. I was invited to join George Norrie there. And I proposed to the Canadian audience that they should petition the United States for being the country where the first well-documented UFO sighting took place, because this is every bit as dramatic as the sighting by Ken Arnold June 24th, 1947, when he was flying over the Cascade Mountains. Well, that's a little bigger picture of what the painting looks like, but those astronomers saw 1, 2, 3, and then many clusters of lights that moved across the night sky in unwavering formation, and each one of them was visible for about 2 minutes or so. So they were not meteors. They were, in 1913, they were not satellites. They were not aircraft with blinking lights on them, and so on and so forth. Very interesting article. There's more of it, February 9th, 1913, Toronto, Ontario. Well, on the subject of astronomers, NASA says, oh, those UFO investigators are crazy people. They don't know what they're talking about. Well, if that's the case, why did NASA publish a very interesting document in July of 1968, a year before we first walked on the moon? It's technical report number 277, published by NASA. You can see the NASA logo up there. And it was written or edited by Mrs. Barbara M. Middlehurst, who was a very sophisticated light astronomer, very experienced at Flagstaff, Arizona. Her husband, also a light astronomer, that is, people who gaze through telescopes, he was a very well-known astronomer, and she was commissioned to write this document. They went through 600 years of some of the world's leading light astronomers' handwritten notes. Good scientists keep notes, of course. And they were looking for anything unusual about these people's observation of the moon. Could anything be going on up there that these astronomers had discovered hundreds of years ago? They thought they were going to find nothing. They found about 8,000 entries in those astronomers' handwritten notes that made them suspicious as to whether something had taken place on the moon or not. Well, the other question is, how long have UFOs been coming here? Now, many in the state of Washington would say, well, it started with us on June 24th, 1947, but I don't think that's the case. Here is an article out of the Tacoma, Washington newspaper from 1892, I think it's July 2nd, recounting an incident that is very similar to what happened to Travis Walton, except this individual who was rendered unconscious for 30 minutes with a blast of light that shot out of an object that looked like a cigar tube or a sausage, and it blew the man back onto the beach, and he lay there unconscious while his friends and his fellow fishermen were tending to him, trying to resuscitate him. And here's part of that same article. It said, flashes of light and terrible sounds emitted by one in the bay. It was an object that hovered above the salt water of Puget Sound and just hovered there, sending out brilliantly bright, blindingly bright flashes of light and loud sounds. Well, we can go back even farther. This is an ancient Chinese text. The difference between ancient text and modern Chinese is that there are no dictionaries for ancient Chinese texts. So this was given to me by my handball opponent at the University of Washington, Dr. David Konectes. He's a PhD in Oriental languages. He was the chairman of the Department of Chinese Language at the University of Washington. He came up to me on the handball court and he said, Peter, I don't believe in UFOs. That's not my field. He said, however, in the course of my translating this huge document in ancient Chinese, I ran across this and I translated it, and it smacks of a UFO sighting. Now, for those of you who are scientific and prefer primary sources, here's the Chinese. And if you'd like to translate it and send me a copy, we will credit you and we will post it. Well, we find strange paintings on the walls of caves and elsewhere, and it suggests to me, you may have your own opinion, that this phenomenon has been taking place for a long, long time. And we, as a species, are only just beginning to awaken to the fact that we have been visited for a long time. How these people view us, what the relationship between them and us is the only remaining question. And it goes back even further. Here's a cave painting, I think, from Italy. Yes, Val Camonica, Italy, estimated to have been 10,000 years ago. The only remaining question is, could the UFO phenomenon go back hundreds of millions or perhaps billions of years? Well, another question about the government is, do they know about it? And if so, what are they doing about it? Well, they certainly know enough about it to have published this book, The Fire Officer's Guide to Disaster Control, published by the federal U.S. government. And if you turn to, of course it's chapter 13. What other number could it be? This happens all the time. I was once interviewed by Dan Rather on CBS News. Anybody care to guess the date? April 1st. April Fool's Day. But here's a description of the celebrated sighting over Los Angeles, February 26, 1942. They fired, I think they say, 1,433 rounds of anti-aircraft ammunition at a disc that hovered over Los Angeles that night, that morning. Very interesting case. And I've actually talked to people who were personal witness. His name was Roy Drayton, who lived in Los Angeles as a boy, and he witnessed all of this, so I'm sure it took place. Well, do astronomers see UFOs? I presume I've satisfied you to some degree that they do see UFOs, or they take them seriously in any event. Does the U.S. government know about UFOs? They published that NASA document and that firefighter's manual. That suggests to me they know fully well, and they are not. In occasional circumstances in the past and in fits of pique, I've probably accused that government of lying to us. Pretty strong language. I think it is more correct to say that for now about 67, 68 years, they have been shielding the American people from information that they should be sharing with us. That is a more correct statement. Do UFOs have malfunctions? Well, once in a while they do. I'll share a case about that. And how long have they been coming? Well, we've answered several of those 5 questions. This is an event that occurred over McMinnville, Tennessee in January of 1995. I had just taken over the hotline 5 months earlier. I was still pretty naive about this. I had to train myself how to run a UFO hotline. I'd never done it before. And even 5 months into it, I was a little naive. I got a call one Saturday night from the Tennessee Emergency Management administration or agency, TEMA, and they said, this is Officer so-and-so, we have been directed to you by the U.S. Air Force. He went on to say that we just had a UFO blow up over McMinnville, Tennessee. And the Air Force, we called the Air Force to see what we do, and they told us that the people to call is the National UFO Reporting Center. TEMA thought that was a federal agency, super secret. I don't like to mislead people, and I assured them that we were an independent organization, independent of government, and they sent me this document, faxed to me on January 8th, 1995, about an incident that occurred there, and I'm going to go through these slides very quickly. This is a deputy sheriff's handwritten notes detailing what had happened. I'm going to summarize quickly. People from all around the airport in McMinnville, Tennessee, in Warren County, I think it is, saw a group of objects, extremely bright, cobalt blue, descending slowly over the airport. Suddenly, for reasons not known to me, or perhaps to anybody else, one of those objects exploded like a hand grenade, and it sent big shards of blue, cobalt blue fragments high in the sky that cascaded down all over McMinnville. Within 90 minutes, I am told by a private investigator, there were people in that area knocking on people's doors at midnight in a rural area of Tennessee. That's not the type of thing I'd like to do, frankly, and requested permission to go on their property and search for fragments of an airplane that had blown up over McMinnville, Tennessee. This is the deputy sheriff's hand-drawn map. People were at these points on the circumference of that circle. Very interesting case. So we've answered, I think, all but one of the questions. Do we ever capture good photographs? Well, that leads me into some of the cases I'm going to talk about. The first four cases I'm going to go through very, very quickly. Because first of all, you've seen them, many of you have seen them before, and I always like to bring new, fresh, interesting information to my audiences, so I don't like to dwell on cases that I've already presented before many of you. This is a very interesting case. December 29th, 1994, I got a call from a woman who lives in eastern Washington, not far from where I live there now. I'm about 50 miles west of Spokane. And she was terrified. In fact, when she called me, she apprised me that she was never going to go outside after dark ever again by herself. She was driving on this road, Zaring Cross Road, going to the north, and her kids said, "Mummy, Mummy, what are those lights out in the wheat field?" Those looked like something unusual, and she glanced over as she was driving. She had 6 kids in her car, 6 of her 7 kids. And she thought they were lights on an 18-wheeler, except it's December 29th, and there are no 18-wheelers in wheat fields on December 29th in eastern Washington. It's usually 2 or 3 feet deep in snow. And she looked back, and long story short, she saw 3 objects that looked like that. I'll show you a little better picture. This is her car. This is her drawing. She stopped her car, rolled down the window, and these objects went directly over her car and in front of her car, and she got a very good look at them. One of them was no farther away than the back of this auditorium is from me. And they went by very slowly, and because she had rolled her window down, she could hear the whining coming from one of them. She said it was a strange, strange sound. Very interesting case, and that is her rendition of what it looked like. And that is the mother's drawing of what one of the craft looks like, and this is her daughter's drawing showing the 3 objects. Very interesting case. What are those? I don't think they're drones. I don't think they're weather balloons. I don't think they're crash dummies or swamp gas. Very interesting case. Second case, Pennsylvania Fireball, and I focused and dwelled on this case 4 years ago. One of the most interesting cases I have, and I may be able to show a little video if I go through it quickly. The best UFO video I believe I've ever seen. I'm going to try to show it. A large round fireball streaked over Ontario, apparently over Lake Erie, headed south. It passed into the western end of the state of Pennsylvania, and then it stopped. Let me show you what it looked like. Well, let me play a video, and I'm going to direct you a little bit. What you will see is a perfectly round object. Your first impression will be, well, that's a full moon. But it's not the moon, and it's strobing, and it's moving away from the camera. There was a television news team from Windsor, Ontario, that was out in the field that night doing an investigation, and the camera operator had the presence of mind to hit the start button and capture this thing with his television-grade video camcorder. The only reason I have this video is thanks to Mrs. Amy A. Bear from Texas, a UFO investigator. She called me 3 years after this incident, and she said, "Peter, did you ever get a report about a strange fireball in western Pennsylvania?" And I knew immediately what she was talking about, and I gave her the proper date, and she said, "Yeah, that's it." She said, "What do you think of the video?" And I said, "Video? You got video? What part of my body do I have to donate to your cause to get that video?" She said, "Oh, I'll just send you a copy." Let me play the video. Some of you may remember this video. This is very, very interesting. And when you see the round fireball, look down at the 530 position below it, and you tell me after this video has played what you see there. Here we go.
Residents from Canada to Michigan, as well as some scientists, fired up. John Kellplant reports it might have been a meteor shower.
Nothing but a charred skeleton remains of the burned-out mobile home, but it's managed to draw crowds of curious onlookers, the media, and scientists, because of early reports that the blaze was caused by a meteorite. Maddie Jessup is a witness who lives nearby.
I pulled up just after a friend of mine, and she had seen this fireball. She actually saw the fireball, and they followed it right into here. The airport is just about 3/4 of a mile up, and we both thought it was a small aircraft that was coming down. We talked to the Windsor police, and they said somebody had also reported a fireball, so now we're thinking meteorite, possible, very possible.
We're not precluding that it wasn't something from the sky, and we're not precluding that it wasn't arson, so at this point, we don't know.
Okay, did the fire department from Windsor initially say that it was caused by the meteorite and they had recovered something?
No, I have no reports from the fire department at all in my possession.
A professor and a student from the University of Windsor Earth Sciences Department poked through the debris this morning looking for evidence of a meteorite. They used a special device to detect radiation, but they came up empty-handed.
Okay, what'd you find in there?
Nothing. Absolutely nothing. There's no evidence of any meteorite impact. It doesn't rule out that there wasn't one, but there is no evidence of it. If there was one, it was probably a very small, maybe nut-sized or even smaller, that would still provide the kind of a trace that you see in the sky, but when it hits the ground, it doesn't leave much of a trace on the ground.
A local astronomer tells us 100 tons of meteors pass through the atmosphere every day.
What that object did, it started up in Ontario, it apparently crossed Lake Erie, it passed into the western end of Pennsylvania, it got down to Bedford, Pennsylvania, Breezewood, Pennsylvania, and it stopped. And there was a professional race car driver going by on the Pennsylvania Turnpike, and suddenly the whole valley that he was in lit up like it was high noon in Needles, California on the 4th of July. He said it was the brightest light he's ever seen. And hovering off to his left was an object that looked like a blue ball with a black ring around its equator and a black ring at the southern pole. Very interesting case. Well, I'm going to accelerate a little bit. Here's another astronomer report. This gentleman saw that object from 250 miles away from New York City, and he submitted a written report. He identifies himself as a PhD in physics and cosmology and astronomy. And the reason I'm inclined to accept his self-description is because it took him 14 months to get the written report submitted. Typical PhD. Thank you, Lord, for sparing me from PhD-dom. I never got one. Tempted, but I never got one. Anyway, this is his description of the object. He said it was one of the brightest objects he's ever seen in our atmosphere. Again, that's what the flight path looked like, and people all along this flight line reported it, and they all said the same thing. It was blue, and it was going from north to south, and then we have the report that it had stopped. A very interesting case, and that's a little better description so you can see it better, or better illustration of what it looked like. Well, there was another case from New Mexico. I call it the New Mexico flash case. It was a Sunday night. It was the 15th of August, 1999, and a flash of light occurred over the southwestern United States that in many parts people reported that it just lit up the entire area around them, again, like the high noon on the 4th of July. And that flash was reported to our center from as far south as Mexico and as far north as Montana. And then, and this is what makes it interesting, and this is what makes me disagree with the Sandia astronomers who say, oh, Mr. Davenport is one of those loony UFO nuts. It happened 21 minutes later over Arizona. A very, very interesting event. And I indicate that fact here. It was captured with sky cameras all over the southwestern United States. These are devices built by Sandia National Laboratories and given to astronomers to record what happens in their sky 24 hours a day. It's a little difficult to see here, but there's a polyvinyl tube up here, and it has a camcorder in this that looks straight down on this hemispherical mirror. So if anything moves across the sky, day or night, its image will be reflected off of this hemispherical mirror, and the camera up here will see an image like this, and it caught this event. Let me play for you one audio clip of what Mr. Jake Hottle is his name. I can reveal his name because he's gone public about this. What he described, this is shortly after the incident occurred. Let's see. No, maybe I won't. I think I took the audio out of this. I apologize, but these are video frames separated by one another by 1/30th of a second. A video camera takes 30 frames a second, and this is why you can capture movement. And these are still frames taken from that video, and this shows you what occurred. An immense flash. It was about 60 or 80 miles west of Albuquerque, and it illuminated Sandia Mountain on the east side of Albuquerque so brightly that it blanked out cameras. It was so bright as a reflected image that it blanked out cameras altogether, and it overmodulated the camera is the technical term, I believe. Case number 4, and this is about where I got cut off 4 years ago. So I'm going to reintroduce you to the Phoenix Lights case. In my opinion, the most dramatic event, UFO-related event that has occurred in modern ufology. Is there anybody in the room who has not heard about the Phoenix Lights? Anybody? I'm not surprised. We have one. Okay. I'll touch on it briefly, but the interesting thing is that this object was intercepted over Camelback Mountain. Just yesterday I flew through Phoenix, and I was at the Phoenix Airport, Sky Harbor Airport, looking north to Camelback Mountain. An object came right over Camelback Mountain, and that is precisely where it was intercepted by 2 F-15 fighters that I think earlier that day had chaperoned President Clinton down to Florida, and I'll touch on that in just a moment. It's the second coincidence that I'd like to touch on. This is one of the early reports I received from a gentleman in Henderson, Nevada, which is on the southeastern corner of Las Vegas. It's a bedroom community for Las Vegas. And That was his sighting. Here's another handwritten report. This is a little bit before the days of the internet, before the internet had come online fully. So I asked people to send a handwritten description, a map, and so on and so forth. And these are some of the reports that I got. This is my worksheet from that night. You see Thursday night, the 13th of March, 1997, at 19:22 hours. That was my first call. In Arizona, that was 8:22, because at that time there was a 1 hour difference between the West Coast and Arizona. This is a police officer called me, a retired police officer, and he was just driving out of his neighborhood and he saw lights that looked something like that to the west of him, and it was so dramatic that it induced him to turn his SUV around and go back to his house to protect his family. That was his immediate reaction. It was so dramatic. And people have provided us with many images. The bottom line is, that night, not fewer, we believe, not fewer than 5 objects, each of which was that large in the night sky as they passed over Phoenix. People described that they subtended an arc above their head equal to about 135 degrees of arc. And these are the same objects that the U.S. Air Force, within hours or days, was trying to convince the American people were nothing but flares that had been launched over the Gila Men firing range 80 miles to the southwest of Phoenix. Nothing could be further from the truth. That's what Robert and Barbara Lee saw as it went over their head north of Phoenix. People did all sorts of things to try to illustrate, at my request, what it really looked like. And one guy used black paper and white ink to simulate accurately what they looked like. And you can see that each one of the lights had, in fact, 3 separate lights to it when this gentleman was looking at them. There's yet another illustration of what a person saw, and he shows multiple lights along the leading edge. Well, this is what it looked like. One of the 5 objects looked like when it passed over Camelback Mountain. This is an artist's rendition taken from the witness's hand drawing, which she faxed to me on the 16th of March, 1997. Mrs. Susan Watson has 7 children. 4 of her children were home, 2 daughters, 2 sons. This is about 20:23 or 20:24 hours, 8:24 at night. And Mrs. Watson was buttoning up her house. She was taking her children to an Irish music concert in preparation for St. Patrick's Day. And she was in the house turning lights off, buttoning up, locking doors, and so on and so forth. And her 4 children started screaming out in the front yard, "Mommy, Mommy, come quickly." And she raced outside expecting to see a crashing airliner. This is very close to Sky Harbor Airport, just on the north side of Sky Harbor. And she looked up and she was not prepared for what she saw hovering above her house and her neighborhood. She saw an object that looked like that. Actually, I keep punching the wrong button. This is what Camelback Mountain looks like as viewed from Sky Harbor Airport. The camera's looking north. You can see the camel's head and the hump and the rump of a kneeling camel. And the object came right over that V in the mountain, and it got directly above Sue Watson's house, and it stopped. And it hovered there, she estimated, her children estimated, for 5 minutes. Her children lay down on the grass and looked up at this marvelous craft. They could see specific details on the ventral surface of that object, and then suddenly it streaked to the south. Would you like to hear what she broadcast, how she described this on the Jeff Rense program? Let me play that if I can. No? We're having some audio-visual problem. We played this before, gentlemen. I don't know what happened. We may come back to that and I'll play it. But what she describes is what they saw. And when I had her on the Jeff Rense program with her children, talking about what they had seen, I asked her, how big did the object look to you to be, Sue, above your head? And I had her hold up her arms and had her two sons, who are pre-engineering students, estimate the angle that her arms formed. And they estimated that it was 135 degrees of arc. That's how big it was above their heads. And we know from another source of information who was in the Air Force that at that moment the object was at least 8,000 feet above their heads. Let me do the trigonometry for you. An object that's that big and is 8,000, that is 1.6 miles above your head, is not less than 7.4 statute miles in width. The object you're looking at is 3 times in width. We estimate, if the information that has come to us is accurate, that's how big it was, 7.4 miles in width. Can we try this?
I went in and I called the airport and news stations and various people like that and could not get anything, but actually I think it was the airport that gave me Peter's number.
Very good. Okay. Go ahead and tell us about it. Tell us what happened.
Well, actually my children had gone out of the house before I did. We were going to a concert that night, and it was a little bit, maybe 20 minutes after 8, I'm not sure, 8:25 or so. And my daughter came running in and said, Mom, you've got to come out of here right now. We've got something coming over Camelback Mountain, which is a landmark in Phoenix, and we live just a mile below it. So I ran outside. At that time, I had 4 children that were outside with me, and we just watched it. It was the most unbelievable thing I've ever seen come over my house, and it came over extremely slow. I mean, it was just kind of coming over this Camelback Mountain, which is, like I say, a landmark with lots of housing on the mountain. Mm-hmm. I live in a pretty populated area, so everybody is watching the same thing that we are. And the kids started laying on their backs on the yard. You know,
they laid down.
Oh, a couple of the 2 boys laid down on their backs in the front yard because it was like magnificent. It was lit with this kind of I don't know how I told Peter it was almost a yellowish light like they have in parking lots. And it was almost a boomerang shape, and it was a solid vehicle. It wasn't something that was separate.
It was coming right toward your house.
It was coming right at, very low. It was flying like extremely low. There was absolutely no sound on it, and there were, I can't remember. I think there were 5 bright lights in front, and actually at one point I saw a laser kind of go down. It was really strange. The kids, we all saw different things, but what we were doing was just basically watching at a very, very slow pace this vehicle just flying over.
What a sight that I just...
Went right overhead. And it was huge, and there were 5 of them all over the city of Phoenix that night. And there was also a disc that was seen, allegedly, streaking across the city of Phoenix from east to west at very high speed. We don't know what happened that night. I am satisfied that we have no idea where these things came from, but they were not, I'm convinced of it, flares launched over the Gila Bend firing range 80 miles to the southwest of Phoenix. Now, there is some debate among ufologists as to what the lights were seen to the southwest of Phoenix at 10:02 p.m. At 10:02 p.m., it is my opinion, based on the evidence available to me, that this whole incident had completely taken place and it had ended. My suspicion, absent proof, my suspicion is that the U.S. government has package deals on the shelf such that when they have a very dramatic UFO event occur, they quickly grab one of those off the shelf. They order the local Air Force base to launch whatever they have, disperse flares to take people's attention off of what has just occurred. The U.S. government is dedicated to not letting this information get to us. I think that's wrong. If we lived in a totalitarian state like the old Soviet Russia or Nazi Germany, where they have totalitarian regimes that make decisions for everybody, well, maybe justified. But we still live in a country where, at least in theory, it is we, the citizens and the voters and the taxpayers, who dictate to our government what they're going to do for us. That is what the political philosophy I subscribe to. I'll bet a lot of you are sympathetic to that, and they owe us this information, good, bad, or indifferent, irrespective of whatever they may know, whatever the future of this may be. Thank you. Whatever this may translate to, they owe us an explanation, at least to the extent that they are aware of the phenomenon. Well, they launched F-15s out of Luke Air Force Base. They came around, they intercepted that object. When the pilots returned to Luke Air Force Base, the lead pilot could not get himself out of the aircraft. His ground crew had to raise the canopy, undo his shoulder, his lap straps, and his knee straps, and physically lift him out of the aircraft. And I believe that lieutenant colonel, he will not talk, that lieutenant colonel is one of the officers who had chaperoned the president down to Florida earlier that morning to go golfing with the professional golfer Greg Norman from Australia. You probably recognize the name. And I'll show you a photograph in a moment. Another different looking object went down Interstate 10 from Phoenix down to Tucson to the southeast, and people on the highway, Stacy Rhodes in particular, Mrs. Stacy Rhodes, reported that it was so large when it went over them, slowly, it went to the southeast while they were driving to the northwest, that it completely blocked out all of the stars above their head. They could not see any stars. It covered so much of the sky. And that is Mrs. Rhodes' hand-drawn illustration. She said, the object we saw was much, much larger than is previously described. It was huge. I suspect at least 7 miles in width. And these are the photos, or part of the video that was taken a few minutes after 10 p.m. Again, keep in mind, this is about an hour and a half after that object had hovered above Mrs. Susan Watson's home. And I believe that these may be flares launched out of A-10 Warthogs flown by the U.S. Air Force, but I cannot prove it. And this is my telephone log for the 13th of March. The U.S. Air Force had the audacity to report to the American people that they didn't know what people like me, these crazy ufologists, were talking about, because their base had not taken a single call all night long. Well, here is my telephone bill, March 13th, it's for 1997, at 10:02 p.m. to Litchfield Park, Arizona, 602-856-7411. Somebody here might try to dial that number, because that'll take you to the Luke Air Force Base switchboard. And they told me when I called, they were too busy to talk to me. I'll bet they were busy. Sue Watson also called them. That's where she got my number, the National UFO Reporting Center, 206-722-3000. That's why she called me. That's why you heard her voice. Also, the next morning, March 14th, I made all sorts of calls. Los Angeles, Litchfield Park, Los Angeles, Deer Valley, Arizona, trying to find out what had happened. All I knew that Friday morning was that I had been buried with information. Calls, I must have taken 100 calls in 8 hours or less. It was a very dramatic night. Anyway, very few articles. This is the first article I'm aware of from the Daily Courier in Prescott Valley, I believe it is, written by Laura Hinchy. If she were here, I would have her come up on this platform and I would give her a big hug, because she was dedicated. She knew as a journalist that something unusual had happened. This is another article. Here's another coincidence. I think this is the second or third coincidence I've presented to you, and there are a couple more. Within seconds of the interception of that object over Sue Watson's home, U.S. military forces, we believe, I cannot prove it, but we have good, strong evidence from general officers who assure me personally that they knew fully well about the Phoenix Lights. They raised U.S. military forces from Defense Condition 5 skipping 4 altogether straight to Defense Condition 3. And concomitant to that, within minutes certainly, possibly within seconds of that, the President of the United States, who was overnighting at the home of Greg Norman, the golfer, the President had been flown from Washington, D.C. down to Orlando, Florida, played golf all day long with Greg Norman, and he was allegedly standing outside and the ligaments in his knee just gave way. He had to be spirited back to Washington, D.C. For emergency surgery. And this is a photograph of the President lying in a hospital bed with what is reputed to be his wife standing next to him. As far as I know, it was. I have no reason to doubt whatsoever. And one of two things: either the President was injured, and I suspect if that's the case, he was injured because he was being raced to a waiting vehicle. I presume that when a general declares a DEFCON 3, which is one step short of World War, that somebody picks up the phone and lets the commander-in-chief know about it. Under those circumstances, it's important to get the commander-in-chief to a military safe area where his presence is not known, where he's safe, and so on.
He hurt himself.
Pardon?
He hurt his knee going down the steps of Greg Norman's house.
Yeah, we have a comment here. He injured his knee going down the steps at Greg Norman's house, but there are multiple stories, and I think they've gotten their stories mixed up. They've told them so long. As Mark Twain once observed, somebody asked Mark Twain, is there any difference between an honest man and a liar? Took the cigar out of his mouth and he said, no, not really, except the liar has to have a better memory. Well, here's a USA Today article. This is now 13 weeks after the incident had occurred, and finally it breaks into the USA, the national press, June 18th, 1997. And the Arizona Republic says it's UFO mania. Well, I'm going to speed up. I've got a few more cases to talk about. Here's another very interesting case, the Bangor submarine case. We had our audiovisual man down here. You may not be able to see him, Tom Dickinson. I met him just last night, 22 and a half years in the U.S. Navy. He was a submarine man. He will enjoy this story in particular. On Wednesday night, April 22nd, 1998, at about 10:20 p.m., an object came out of Canada, headed south. It went over Bangor submarine base. It slowed and stopped over the nuclear weapons storage bunkers at Bangor Sub Base. Then it continued on, and it was last seen by a deputy sheriff in Yakima, Washington, going straight north at high speed, and by the time it had gotten over there, it had changed colors. This distance, this ground track, I estimate to be not less than 500 miles, probably closer to 600 miles. It covered that distance in less than 10 minutes. That's an average velocity of 3,600 miles an hour. And it also included 3 separate stops. It stopped twice here, it slowed over Bangor Sub Base, and it stopped over Interstate 5 just north of Portland, Oregon. Very interesting case. This is my initial attempt to reconstruct that's what it looked like when it went over the nuclear weapons storage bunkers. I'm going to speed up a little bit here because I have a special mission and a special subject to present to this audience, but I wanted to cover these incidents. We hear about mutilated animals. This was an animal abduction case, February 25th, 1999. This is one of the cases I ran out of time and didn't get to present to you 4 years ago. Very interesting case. That's what the countryside looks like out west of Mount St. Helens that blew up, as you may remember, in May of 1980. This is Robert Fairfax and I, and the object was over this valley and this sloped area, and that's what it looked like. It was no bigger than the average U.S. automobile, and it actually flew directly towards a herd of elk that panicked except for one animal that started trotting off in a different direction, and that object went right after that elk and picked it up out of the forest and flew off with it. Very interesting case, and we think we found the elk. We think this was the animal. It had perfectly good teeth. It was well fed. It was not sick by any overt signs anyway. Very interesting case. And Bob Fairfax did an article July of 1999 in the UFO Journal. Very interesting. Well, it's not just animals in the forest that UFOs are inclined to abduct. How many have heard about the Todd Seas case? Not very many. Good. Sunday morning, 5 a.m., the 4th of August, 2002. Mr. Todd Seas, age 37, I believe, left his home in Northumberland County, Pennsylvania. That's south central Pennsylvania. And he was going up to his family property that had been in his family for many, many generations to scout out populations of deer in preparation for the deer hunting season. And we don't know what happened to him. We don't know what he did during the subsequent 30 minutes, but at 5:30 a.m., 4 adult witnesses, a farmer and 3 fishermen floating down the Susquehanna River, saw a man's body, allegedly, a man's body clad only in undergarments, being floated up slowly in a shaft of light that connected the top of Mount Montour, where Mr. C's property was, to a disc that was hovering above the top of the mountain. The body was seen to reach the disc, and it went into the disc. The disc then jumped a short distance to the west and hovered there for a few moments, and then suddenly shot off to the west faster than the human eye could follow it. Well, that triggered a manhunt, and I'm going to show you some of the photographs, or some of the articles, photographs of the articles about this man's death. They mounted a search party. There were about 200 or 250 people in the search party. They searched for 40 hours. They did not find any trace of Mr. C's except his all-terrain vehicle with his outer clothing neatly folded and stacked on top of the back of his, what do they call those vehicles? I've forgotten, a four-wheeler, essentially. Until Monday, 7:15 p.m., this is the day after he was seen, or at least a man's body was seen being levitated into a saucer, his son was searching around the family home. This is about 3 or 4 miles from where Mr. C's had last been seen. And tragically, his son looked up in heavy underbrush, or perhaps a tree, I don't know which for sure, and saw what he took to be human remains. Police were summoned immediately for reasons that they won't state. As far as I'm aware, they immediately summoned the FBI that came racing to the scene, and they closed off the area. They took Mr. C's remains to a local hospital. He reportedly, one source, one witness only, unfortunately, he had some kind of device clamped to his body. I believe it was his upper arm, looked metallic. Nobody could recognize it or identify it. They took the remains then to the coroner's office, performed an autopsy. Mr. James Kelly, the new coroner of Northumberland County, performed the autopsy. I called him. I said, Coroner Kelly, I'm Peter Davenport. I'm the director of the National UFO Reporting Center. I'm calling about an autopsy that I'm led to believe your office conducted, that of Mr. Todd C's, and I'm calling to seek information. And he said, well, I'm not able to give you very much, but I'd be happy to talk to you. That conversation lasted for about 1.5 minutes, and then he said, Mr. Davenport, I'm going to have to terminate this conversation because I have information that I can't give you. And I said, well, were photographs taken of the decedent's remains during the autopsy? He said, yes, but you will never see them. I said, but they're matter of public record. Well, not in this case. So a very interesting case.
a very important man in my life, Colonel Philip Corso. In 1957, Phil found himself in a very strange situation. He was in a cave in a canyon in New Mexico. He had been investigating an otherworldly crash device of some kind and now found himself face to face with a translucent entity that was standing in the cave. The glow, I think, as I recall, had drawn him to go there to see what was inside. The entity asked him telepathically if he would grant him 10 minutes radar free so he could leave in the device, which was intact on the ground nearby. Corso replied, 10 minutes can be an eternity. What do you offer? And he received the most important single sentence that has ever been said in the whole experience to anybody. A new world, if you can take it. You guys, can you take it? You're gonna take it. You gotta do it two ways. You gotta get out there and you take it, and you gotta bear it. This is the next step for this species. That's what he brought, what Phil brought out of that cave. Well, how do we take it? By sitting passively, waiting for something to happen? Oh, no. People can meditate and in that way cause a light to show up in the sky. You've heard about that. Some of you have probably gone to those sessions where they do it. Then they look up at the light, pay perhaps a facilitator a nice fee, and the light goes out. Why didn't it come closer? Why didn't it engage? If ever there was a question essential to our future, that's it. Over 18 days in July of 1952, such lights appeared in Washington. We, yesterday morning, heard a wonderful lecture about another situation in New Mexico where such lights appeared, just about the same time in the early 50s. They were seen by thousands, tracked on radar, but nothing happened. Why not? They were talking to us and we weren't saying anything back. We need to create our side of the conversation. This is the beginning of taking a new world. When they talk to us, we need to respond. And they are talking and have been for a very long time. This is the UFO that was hanging around in my neck of the woods when I had my close encounter in 1985. This actual picture was taken up in Brewster, New York in 1984. This one showed up in Scotland a couple months ago. This one showed up in San Diego 2 weeks ago. This is taken outside of an airplane, from an airplane. They're here. This is the type of UFO that I associate in my mind with the richest form of encounter. Whoever they are, or whatever they are, they are here now, ready to do a lot more than show up and wait, then depart. We can engage with them, but it's going to take a deep change of worldview, effectively a change of being, to take what's on offer. I want to take it, and I think we can. But it's going to require a very profound change, at least among this tiny band of us. Those of us who are turned toward this experience instead of either ignoring it or turned away from it. We're going to have to stop waiting. It'll be hard, but it's possible, and it's essential. The stakes are not small. If we don't do this and stay the way we are, there are a lot of risks. To open yourself, heart and mind and soul, to the visitors is a very hard thing to do. Look at what Linda was talking about last night. This is not all sweetness and light. It's not all sweetness and light on the savannah in Africa either. If you're a wildebeest, you got to be aware of the fact that the lions get hungry. And it's on a much more subtle and complex level than that. But not everything in this experience is something we are going to want to embrace. It may want to embrace us. To take this new world, we have to face ourselves in our truth. That's even harder. When I was with the visitors in 1985, I screamed like a terrified animal. They had a machine repeating the phrase, "What can we do to help you stop screaming?" in this soft voice. One of the things would have been to turn off that machine. I realized later that this had happened because even though we are social creatures at ease with one another, we're not wild. We're all tame. We're tame to each other. We've tamed animals. Dogs are tamed. Cats are tamed. Horses, some cattle. We're not tame. And when we show up, when someone from outside of our context shows up, you'll find that, gee, I didn't realize this, but I'm a wild animal. We're a wild species. All the lights in the sky, the close encounters, the mythology, the stories, all of this is about getting used to them. It's a process of taming. But oh, the complexity and the deceptions. Taming is a very interesting thing. Hitler's dog Blondie loved him. We need to be very careful about who we decide to love in this case. In July of 1997, I sat across from Phil at a restaurant in Roswell, New Mexico, on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the Roswell incident, and listened as he told me his story. The moment he said those words, "A new world if you can take it," I knew he was telling the truth. There are two reasons. The first is the multiple meanings of the statement. If we can bear this new world, we can take it for ourselves, and that it fits perfectly with the message that is at the core of my own experience and of that of so many others. A lot has already been given to us, more than enough, as you'll see, that we must stop waiting and start taking. Disclosure would help, but it's not the whole answer. It would empower those of us trying to draw the human species down this new path, though, that it would do. What will happen if there is disclosure is two things. First, perhaps there will be some documents released that show in the early 50s that we were taking the idea that this was intelligently guided very seriously and concluded that it was. The next day or the day after that, reporters will start asking about, well, wait a minute, what about the alien abductions? And the government will have to be willing to respond to that. Then they will go out into the world and they will go after everybody who has a horror story. And that's all you'll hear. Nothing but horror stories, scary stories, anything to juice the ratings. Any lie, any truth, as long as it's terrifying, will be out there ad nauseum. And where will we be? We're going to have to be dealing with this somehow. It's not going to be easy. The government already knows a little bit, not enough to set us on the path to a viable human future. They think in terms of technology, structured craft, exotic machines, aliens, old thinking. New thinking is very different. Old thinking says there are aliens here from this planet and that. New thinking says, it's what I said in communion, the human mind winks back from the dark. This is real powerful. It's real powerful. Respect it. Trust it. Us, not only in our bodies, in the greater state that is mother to us all. In my book, Supernatural, with Jeff Kripal, we condense the enigma that is mankind into three questions. Who are we? Where are we? And why are we here? But notice the word supernatural is cut into two parts. This is because all of these phenomena that we group into the supernatural and generally dismiss are actually part of nature. They are indeed super in the sense that they are amazing and difficult or impossible to understand, but they're also real. They're events. They happen. People see them and report them all the time. Thus, they are natural. We've been deciding either that we know what they are or that they are nothing at all for all of our history. Let's make a cut. Leave all of our assumptions and beliefs behind. Let's finally allow ourselves to be alone with the great questions. Erase the assumptions. Start again alone in the mystery. Ghosts? Let's instead ask, what are they? Aliens? Let's instead ask, What are they and who are they really? And what does that mean to us? Before we go on, I want to read my dedication from the book to an amazing, brilliant, and profoundly conscious human being, Anne Strieber, upon whose shoulders all of my own insights rest. The visitors taught and Anne interpreted. She didn't get the excitement of facing them. She got the hard work of understanding them. And she did that work with excellence. From Supernatural. Anne and I evolved our approach to the supernatural together. She contributed 3 foundational insights. The first is that the close encounter experience is something unknown and must be kept in question. Second, that the question must be deepened and only can be resolved by scientific and academic inquiry. It must no longer be dismissed with assumptions, beliefs, and premature theorizing. Third, that after reading in excess of 200,000 testaments from the public about close encounter experiences, she was able to say with authority that close encounters with apparent aliens often include perceptions of the dead as well. And boy, the old-time abduction researchers of the old days sure did not like to hear that, but it's true. It happened often at our cabin. We'll explore some of the reasons she drew that critical conclusion in a moment. But let's start at the beginning of the path that her insights opened, that has been left for us by the visitors in the lives of close encounter witnesses. And it's very important to go to the narratives, go to the testimony, go to what people are saying, and look at that. Betty Andreasson. Among the many close encounter narratives is a case of extraordinary importance, one that is pivotal to our understanding of our situation in this world. This is the case of Betty Andreasson Luca, who, thanks to the patient support of investigator Ray Fowler, was able to communicate a message that is critical to our understanding of ourselves, where we are, and our future. When I was listening to Betty's narrative, I heard her repeat some words in what was identified as a star language. However, I recognized by their structure that they were some form of Gaelic. It was not a familiar form. In fact, the words are in a very ancient Gaelic, and they translate as, "Children of the northern peoples, you wander in eternal darkness." Not a place one wants to be. Truly, it is where we are now. Eternal or not, though, it is not where we need to stay. We have another name for that darkness. We call it history. We have another name. We call it time. If we join the two halves of the human species, build that bridge, then everything is going to change. So how do we do it? I'm going to address that question in a number of ways. First, with the tarot. In the mid-70s, I was given a powerful message, the original purpose of the Tarot of Marseille, the oldest known set of tarot cards. I will use elements of what I learned today, and I wrote a book called The Path that lays this all out. Unfortunately, it's out of print, and I haven't been able to afford to get it reprinted, but I'm going to get it printed electronically, and so at least it'll be an electronic book quite soon. You can read the whole thing. The Hermit. We need some light, our own light, held up by our own arm to guide our own way. This is the card of the part of mankind that wants to take this journey. This is you. It's both a card of introspection and of growth, looking inward and outward for direction. The Hermit is not standing still. He's not wandering like the fool in the tarot. Looking within. I'm going to tell you a little bit how to do that. We have two bodies. There's more to us even than that. But we have a physical body, and then we have what I would call there's a non-physical kind of copy of this body that is receiving all of the impressions of life that the physical is sending it. We call it the soul, but it's bigger than what I'm going to be talking about. The part of it I'm going to be talking about I call second body, and a lot of people do. It's a very exact, non-physical, almost replica copy of first body. And when you're out of your body, you can be in that state, or you can also turn into other forms as well. But the way you get to that is very simple. You sense your first body. You sit quietly. You can sit on the floor in the lotus position if you wish, but if you're like me and you'd have to call the fire department to get you up again, you might want to try a chair. A nice stiff back chair, like a dining room chair. So not a real easy chair, because you're going to go to sleep. You don't need any music. You don't need any special tapes. You don't need any funny sounds. You just need yourself in a quiet space for a few minutes. And you take your attention, and you have attention, and you can move it around. Normally it goes on its own. Your attention's all coming up here right now. And that's normal, that's natural. But you can control your attention. You take your attention and you put it on your physical sensation, on the way your body feels. You go down to your left foot, you work up your leg, right leg, both legs, hands, arms. Then you go to down to your lower back and you work up your back. There's not many nerves there, so it takes a lot of concentration to go up your back to your face and head, down your front. Then you expand your attention to feel your whole body. It won't seem like you're doing much, but believe me, sense first body, feed second body. Second body gets stronger and stronger the more you do this. And the stronger second body gets, the more you go down that bridge into a bigger reality. I can assure you this is true. I've been doing it for 50 years, and it works, and it is just that simple. We'll do a little more with this in a few minutes. There's another thing you can do. You know, this has all got to be, it's simple and it's free. You mustn't worry about getting UFO, going to pay somebody a lot of money to conjure up a UFO. You can do that too. Go out in the backyard, do the sensing exercise, and shine a light up in the sky every so often, and it'll be very frustrating, but you will see something, and when that happens, there's another thing you can do that will draw more interest to you. Are you going to be with the good guys or the bad guys? Well, let's put it this way. There's a way of making sure you're in the right place. In the ancient path I've been following ever since it was given to me, the opposite card of the hermit is the lover. The lover is everybody, all the billions of people who aren't in little rooms like this scattered around the planet at the moment or doing similar work. The lover loves life. He's completely devoted to the physical. He loves his cars, his exotic foods, his pleasures, his gadgetry. He's listening to that siren song. Buy another Chevy. Go eat at McDonald's. Do this, do that. Watch the latest movie. Live. Be in the physical. You don't have a soul. Do it now. Do it now. Give me the money too. There's so much more than that. It's just that the other part is quiet. We don't listen to it. It's very hard to listen to. The lover loves life, but too much. He's devouring the world. We can't stop him. It's not going to happen. It has to be accepted. The hermit, though, is on a quest. You seek knowledge of what is true, and with this seeking, you are looking toward the future of mankind. The hermit's light, that is his curiosity. How will we survive? What does it mean to be a little fish lying in the blaze of the sun? We've got gills and fins. How do we stand up and walk? Let's discuss what we're searching for, the nature of that new world, how to take our place in it, and if we manage that, how to face the challenges it will offer, most specifically the challenge of seeing and bearing ourselves as we really are, using our strengths and accepting our weaknesses. Our chief weakness is fear. It exists because of the vulnerability of the body. It is always there. It is within each of us. You cannot conquer it. Don't even bother. Always. We have to accept it and learn to work past it. Every time I went out and started, when I realized there was something more to my experience than I was crazy or I'd been drugged or something, I started going out in those woods at night. And that was hard. It was really scary. It was unbelievably difficult. It was so hard that I had to think carefully to make my feet walk, to make them walk down those paths in the dark. Because there was something there, and boy, I didn't know what it was, and boy, was it tough. I did it anyway. And I realized after the first year or so of doing it that A, the visitors were really interested because I was doing it, and B, I would never not be afraid. I would always be afraid. And the few times they showed up, they were real wary too, and I realized, wait a minute, they're scared too. They're scared of me now that I'm not under any restraint of any kind. They're scared too. And they were little old vulnerable creatures. They looked fragile as hell. I probably could have just folded one up and put it in my pocket. They're dealing with these crazy, thick, big giants. Of course they're scared. And also the giants don't know what the hell's going on, and that makes them really dangerous. Our chief strength is our ability to love. Not to love the things of the world, like the card of the lover, but to love each other. To really do this. To see ourselves as a single entity, mankind, born of the earth. Not a species somehow separate from our planet, but part of it. Its body is the earth we tread, the water we drink, the food we eat. Its heart is the living world, the rage and joy of the animals, and our inner animal. We are the mind of this earth, and it is as the mind of our planet, seeing ourselves in this role and learning to serve our mother, that we will awaken into new life. If the baby is to be born alive, it will be because we have understood what this new world is and how to take it. In her 2004 diary about her near-death experience, Anne closed with the comment, "All that really survives of us is love, the love that we have made in the world. It is a simple truth that will stay with me forever, even when I pass again across this threshold, this time never to return, especially then." She was full of love and joy. And when she passed across that threshold, there was a lot left. An evil person doing evil things, there's little left. Little left. I asked her what happens to the evil, and it was a fascinating comment. She said, nothing. In her reality now, they're not there. Where do they go? What happened? I don't know. And I don't really care. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in those of us who are going to come across in some kind of intact state. Taking this new world is about casting open the door between the land of us bodies and the world of those who have left the physical behind. It's about building that bridge. This is our old cabin. The first time I saw a dead person with the visitors was on December the 26th, 1985. It was an old friend. He happened to be a retired CIA officer that had nothing to do with me. I'm not a CIA officer, and I never have been. I don't know anything about it, and all the conspiracy theorists who say that are frankly probably nuts. I thought his presence meant I'd been drugged by people angry over my publication of my book War Day, which was a very political book. Then I found out, about 2 weeks later, that he'd been dead for months when I sat there and talked to him. Well, that threw me. That was one of the first things that made me realize that whatever was happening, it wasn't exactly what I thought. Our dear friend then, Anne's secretary, Laurie Barnes, and Anne had a remarkable ability. She'd be reading these letters and she'd toss one aside and say, "She's going to the cabin. He's going to the cabin." I don't know how she did it. But when they came, boy, was it exciting. Anyway, Lori saw her long disappeared brother walking on our road on an afternoon before the visitors came later that night into our house. He'd been gone for 20 years, just disappeared. The FBI had given up on the case. And he was there, standing before, and she said, "My God, are you all right?" He said, "Yes, I'm fine." And she didn't realize he wasn't physically alive until she stepped toward him and he just floated off into the woods and disappeared. She came back from that experience rather excited. Before that, another encounter in the cabin, a group of people had been in the living room, staying in the living room. Ann and I were upstairs asleep, and we actually were asleep. People who came to the cabin for these events, they did not sleep. So when I say they were in bed, they were all lying in bed in cots and things in the living room. And in the basement, there was a couple sleeping privately in another basement room. What happened was, these little blue guys, which if you read Supernatural, you'll learn a little bit more about them and what they do, showed up. And they're really not scary. They're just hideous, which is something that, they can't help it, right? If frogs worked out really well, that's what they'd look like. They were jumping around in the living room. Everyone could see them. No one could move. They could all talk. In there was a magazine editor of a big magazine who had said, "If they show up, I will put it on the front cover of the magazine." And that's what they were there for. Meanwhile, it didn't happen. Afterwards, the next morning, he said, "I can't do it because it'll ruin my career." I said to myself, boy, I hope it doesn't piss him off. I somehow feel that making him mad would be a difficult problem for me. Anyway, in the basement, the couple woke up and saw standing at the foot of the bed, big as life, a friend who had died in an earthquake a few years before in Mexico. And she said the thing they always say, "I'm all right," and disappeared. In other words, this experience itself opens up, rends the veil between the worlds. The bridge is there. We can cross it. Now let's talk about what was happening. They were crossing that bridge between the worlds, apparently assisted by the visitors. And these guys, they call themselves soul techs, soul technologists. The words consciousness technology were mentioned yesterday. And that's a very good phrase. It's very much what all of this is about, because as Westerners, we want a technology and a science. We're not like people who are content with symbols and kind of things that you can't pin down. And if we're going to have to build a science of the soul, and we will, and we can, and they're here to help. They will help us. If we're going to take the new world, we need to learn how to cross the bridge from our side without assistance. It's supported by 3 pillars, this bridge. Compassion for oneself and others, so we can let go of judgment, of prejudice, of rejection, of anger. Thank you. Curiosity about the world, so we can overcome our fear. I was too curious to hide out there, and a lot of you have done the same in your experiences. I know I've talked to you over the weekend. You're too damn curious. Curiosity killed the cat, but it's hopefully not going to kill us because we're a little smarter than cats. Some cats. Our intelligence will preserve us. If it wasn't sufficient, the visitors, the ones who were midwives to our birth and not trying to sidetrack it, would not even be here. They're the cheapest bunch. I'm telling you, they are very economical about what they do. They are not profligate, as you will find. Acceptance is the 3rd pillar. Once we put aside our beliefs and accept that we are actually adrift in that eternal darkness, the great unknown, then we will make some real progress toward our truths. Can you imagine if you put aside all of your beliefs, everything you believe is true, everything, then where are you? Even the belief that you're a real physical body. Imagine that you don't even know that for sure. Wow. You talk about freedom. You will be free. This is the place where I originally encountered the visitors. The stones weren't there, obviously. I made the stones there and the little path up to it. I remember rising up from that spot into the dreadful, confined, thick space where the visitors surrounded me. Hardly a gateway to the stars, one would think. But that's exactly what it was for me. Because that's what I chose to take from the experience, to take. I will not sit with my arms folded, indulging my anger and doing nothing. No way. I'm on my way. From seeing them, I know it's possible. And what they think of me invading their space, I don't know. I don't care. There's a big universe out there. Let's go. You saw that map last night. You know what it is. It's Betty Hill's star map. To take this new world, we need to meet the visitors at 3 levels. Within ourselves, by evolving our consciousness, in the dark of the night, by coming face to face with them, and in the stars that are their home. Can we go to the stars? What if I told you that the answer is actually yes? You'll hear from the skeptical community, oh, the distances are so great they could never get here. I mean physically, in these bodies. Then when might you might ask? The answer is anytime we put our minds to it. The technology to do so is available off the shelf right now. We do not need exotic propulsion systems. What we need is something like a nuclear rocket, which we were developing back in the 50s, that can achieve a continuous acceleration of 1g for a number of years. In fact, after 2 years of such acceleration, it would be traveling at 97% of the speed of light. For every day that passed on the ship, 18 months would then pass on Earth. In other words, the ship could travel 50 light years in just a matter of months of ship's time. Of course we can go. Of course we can. You know what we really need is not so much a propulsion system. We can figure that out. What we need is, at those speeds that we will be getting to, which would be more like probably 50 or 60% of the speed of light, even the tiniest molecule striking this device will have so much kinetic energy that it would vaporize it. We have to figure out what to do with that kinetic energy. We cannot build materials that absorb it. It's not possible. We have to find a way to make that energy go around the ship. And we can. We can do all of these things. Is it this being done by creatures from other worlds? Of course it is. Many others. At the end of this discussion, we'll see some videos of them, and I'm going to rush along because I've realized I've gotten to the point. I'm not far enough along. I'm too slow. This is a longer talk than I thought. And I don't know if someone could tell me first, would you like to go for an extra half hour? Yeah. Okay. Then I think we can, because all we have after this is a break and an attempt to eat lunch. So I'm going to go I'm going to speed up. I want to get to these videos because they're really a lot of fun. You're going to see some things that you haven't seen before. Okay. Of course we can go to other worlds. And of course people from other worlds are coming here. There's more galaxies in this universe than there are grains of sand on this planet, and more stars in these galaxies than we can count. We can just make rough estimates, and God knows how many planets. You know what we really are? We're rare. There are far more stars in the universe than there are human beings on Earth. Far, far, far more planets. Everybody intelligent, every conscious species is rare. It's actually a little, very precious community struggling together toward ecstasy. That's what the intelligent life of the universe is really all about. Okay, since the beginning of history, we have become blind and more blind to our own souls, therefore living more and more in a world of illusion. Those who are not soul blind have mostly put the filter of belief over the objective reality of the soul, thus creating this wall between inner and outer consciousness. The little blue figures I talk about call themselves soul technologists for a reason. They're sending us a message. It's a science. Being in touch with your soul is a science. And now let's quickly take just another quick look at another part of this. Okay, why would I be talking about the Shroud of Turin all of a sudden? Well, here's why. Because it is the only clear picture ever made of second body at the instant of its emergence from first, our physical body. What actually happened was second body and first body reversed positions at that moment. There was a tremendous blast of energy. How extraordinary that this picture was made so long ago by somebody who probably must have known that it would only become meaningful to us through technology. Somebody knew this would only become meaningful to us when we had the technology to see it, really see it. And this would be emerging, this technology would emerge just at the time that we were going soul blind. Can you imagine the power and the extraordinary insight of the being behind this, who did this for us? The resurrection need not be thought of as a mystery anymore. It isn't. It's not that first body disappears or something, but it changes place with second in the case of an extraordinary individual like Jesus. The physical becomes the passive part, the super physical, the active part, and that was why he could be seen and why there was nothing left in the tomb. And he then was here for 40 days showing himself and demonstrating to himself not that he was someone special, but that we are all someone special. We can all, this is our life. This is what we are building inside ourselves. The light of second body is the light that illuminates that lantern that the hermit was holding up. The shroud's been debunked, of course, but it's quite real. Its message is eloquent. It is startling. Recently on Unknown Country, there was a story about how DNA had been gathered from the dust on the shroud's surface that proved that it had taken the traditional journey from Palestine to Turkey to Italy to France. In other words, it was not created in Italy in the Middle Ages, despite the carbon dating, which was thrown off by the fact that it was in a fire, which the people doing it knew it would be, and that was why they did it. Not only that, it was woven in India, and when it was used to wrap the body of Jesus, it was probably among the very most valuable objects in Jerusalem. He was that precious. People had heard a message, and they knew it was important. Modern science has learned after thousands of years what the physical body is and how it works. We have an immense store of medical knowledge. To leave the darkness, though, and take our place in the new world, we need to do more than that. The new world we need to take is the world of second body. We need to understand it as well as we do first body. We need to find an objective science of the soul. What Jesus left us was not so much the religion that emerged out of his teaching. That was to a degree spun by the imagination of people who wanted power over. What Jesus left was knowledge of second body and how to feed it and how to make it strong. So strong that it actually replaces first body as our primary reality. So what did he do? What did he teach us? He taught us about compassion. He taught us these things. He taught us that all men are equal in the kingdom of heaven. All of us are equal. And you know something fascinating? When you leave first body and you see a lot of people and you're in second body, you can tell they're all equal. You tell it immediately in some way that it's very difficult to put into words. He taught compassion. You know, one of the most compassionate things he ever did was also the thing that probably got him killed. It was the turning over of the money changers' tables in the temple. Because he was showing them, giving them a chance to see their own greed. That's compassion. It's not necessarily all airy-fairy, oh, you're wonderful. Compassion is helping people face their truth. That's real compassion. And then the other thing is the thing that Anne specialized in, love. Love. When you're out in the world passing through life, if you live in a place like I do, like LA, you're going to often find yourself being very, very angry at people who've lost 4/5 of their IQ because they've turned on a car. And they're driving very foolishly indeed, and they're in front of you. And you can see them texting. But how do you love that person anyway? How do you look at everybody you see, even the people who have hurt the hell out of you? And every one of us has got those people in their lives. Love them anyway. You don't have to show it to them if they're too dangerous to you, but you can feel it. You can always feel it, because we are all vulnerable. We are all struggling. We are all afraid. We are all facing this extraordinary transition called death. And we are therefore a little band, all alone in a big universe, facing this. And we can love each other. Find the beauty in everything, every situation you encounter, and know that it's always there. As Anne said, always have joy. The visitor said that, very few words to me spoken aloud. Have joy were two of them, and she seized on that. She said, that's it. That's what it is about. It's not easy. Don't say it's easy, because a lot of horrible things happen in our lives that make it very difficult for us to have joy. That is a picture of someone in joy. Now let me tell you a little bit about, before we go into where are we here? Okay, I'm going to go past this, all of this. I'm going to have to do another lecture. I've got a lot of cool stuff still. Okay. I talk too slow. Okay. All right. Here we are. Take a look, close look. Oops. All right. Let me see if I can make it go back. Oh, no. It went forward. I really can't control these things. I'm so sorry. Yeah. There. Okay. Okay. Now, these are... Okay, there we are. See the man in the background? He didn't see this. This came right in front of him. He did not see it. He did not see it. What is it? Well, if you go to Home Depot in the gardening section, you'll find it. It's a garden gnome. Only this one is very much alive and moving at a high rate of speed. This picture was taken completely by accident outside of Pittsburgh on a trail cam and sent to Linda Moulton Howe. And she called me up and said, Whitley, look at this thing I'm sending you. These people, some guy tried to say, oh, it was a deer. Yeah, see the antler? But the thing is, the man didn't see it. He was looking out into the woods. He didn't see it at all. And it really did go right in front of him. And then Now it won't move. And then it immediately backed up and left the area as soon as it sensed the presence of the trail cam. In other words, we are living in a world that we hardly can even see. Because how could that being be in here right now or something else? Of course. Of course. There's a lot of levels to reality. We're living in one level of physical reality, and just one level of physical reality, and we're talking about moving into other levels beyond this. This is a UFO that showed up over the Okanagan in British Columbia in 2002, during a time when there were quite a few close encounters, including the Karina Sable's abduction, which has been pretty well researched. If you look at it and you remember the ones that were seen in New Mexico back in yesterday that we were looking at, remember the big one that was on the line kind of on its side and was shaped like a plate with a dark center? This is the same thing in many years later. Now let's look at this thing move. It'll turn on its side in a minute. It looks almost fucking UFO. Yes, he was excited. Now, in a couple seconds, we're going to see it extended with 7 frames for every single frame. There's been no alteration, just so you can see it better. It'll come up in a minute. They try to find it again and don't. Or just do for a second. But what I'm trying to show you is first something that's apparently part of this world, because those things have been reported for 500 years. Second, something that would seem to be part of another world. Both of these are verified videos. These are not hoaxes. It's not an internet hoax, any of it. Now,
this clip shows the object once again, but this time what we have done is we have added 6 additional frames to each frame of the video clip in order to slow the object down so that you can see it in detail. We have done nothing whatsoever to enhance this video. We have only slowed it down, and here you see a remarkable transition as it seems to morph from one shade into another and then begins to move rapidly away from the camera. It's a remarkable video. This whole extraordinary video is one of the most authentic ever recorded.
Okay. This next video, this is the Camarillo UFO. This UFO was seen every Thanksgiving over Camarillo, California for 6 years. In fact, there's still a lot of UFO sightings there, but not this particular object. What you're looking at is one of the only UFO videos that's ever been made through a telescope by an astronomer. He's an amateur astronomer, a dear friend, Steve Neal. He's a close encounter witness himself. You can find him on the internet if you Google Steve Neal. He took this with a Celestron telescope, and if you look at it carefully, you can see there's something here that is connected to this bright ball of light. Now, we would have said, well, this must be some kind of a balloon, a weather balloon, if it hadn't appeared 6 years in a row over Camarillo at the same time of the year, and had, although this is not in this video, it had a habit of dropping bright objects down onto the ground. So it was not a weather balloon. Okay, here we go. It blows up. The light blows up, and to the naked eye, it looked like it just suddenly disappeared. Yeah. It looks like it suddenly disappeared. What?
Does it blow up every year?
It disappeared every year. She asked if it blows up every year. It disappeared every year, very suddenly. And when we did it in the telescope, we saw why. Isn't that fascinating? You know what that's about? It's about somebody wanting us to look up. They want us to look up. They want us to look up. So let's do that. This next one is not a hoax. This is real. We have verified it, and I'll tell you how we did that. This little figure in the back, which you will see moving shortly, you notice how high the legs are. That is not something you could do. You could build a thing like that, but we had a special effects artist look at this who said that to build that and make it walk like that would be an enormous undertaking. This video was taken in Southern California by a guy who bought a home security system because he heard something messing around his house and he thought it might be a mountain lion or something like that. He got quite a surprise when he looked at the video. But the reason I've chosen this one is we think in terms of grays, Nordics, tall whites, reptilians, etc., etc., etc. This is a real big universe, and it's really cool. And these guys, take a look at them as they come slowly along, struggling with our gravity and not really. You think of them, what the hell must they think we look like? You think, imagine that? Now, it's going to be very interesting because the little one in the back is going to notice the camera. You watch him when he does that. He'll do that in just a second. The one in the front's about 3 feet tall, and the little one's a little shorter. Isn't that something? Now watch him. He'll notice the camera and turn. See? Turns and notices the camera and then keeps going. But he's going a lot faster now. There they go.
The essence of science is finding the right evidence relevant to the question at hand. We're not talking beliefs, we're talking about data, evidence, logic, reason, all those things we don't hear enough about in a world in which headlines are what do the talking, not the facts, not the data. So I'll try to make the case that we have evidence that many people aren't aware of, especially the nasty, noisy negativists. I like alliteration, as you can tell. I talk sometimes about fossilized physicists and ancient academics, and but the key word is evidence. And so what I try to do is take people by the hand and lead them past some of the best evidence that has convinced me that something exciting is going on. So let me put my 4 conclusions at the beginning of the lecture, after 59 years of study and investigation. First, the evidence is overwhelming that planet Earth is being visited by intelligently controlled extraterrestrial spacecraft. In other words, some UFOs are alien spacecraft. Most are not. I don't care about them. 2, the subject of flying saucers, and people say, what are you talking about flying saucers? Why don't you say UFOs? Because all flying saucers are UFOs. Not all UFOs are flying saucers. All great-grandfathers are men. Not all men are great-grandfathers. So, I happen to be one, incidentally. So the subject of flying saucers, which I prefer to use, intelligently controlled vehicles, not just things that you don't know what they are because they're not close enough or whatever. The subject represents what I call a cosmic Watergate. And I hope most of you remember Watergate. I know it was before some of you were born, but still. a high-level official cover-up of significant information. Because some people know about what's going on doesn't mean all do. You got to be careful. The third conclusion is there are no good arguments against the first two conclusions. And the fourth conclusion is we're dealing with the biggest story of the millennium. I didn't say all millennia. I don't want to get into the religious arguments, what happened 2,000 years ago. I'm talking about, no, only the last 1,000 years. That's what matters. Okay. Now, I've done debates on UFOs. Fortunately, I can say I've won the ones where we've measured the reaction. And there's several areas that the debunkers focus on. First, that there is no evidence. Second, that you can't get here from there. Third, governments can't keep secrets with the internet and YouTube. You can't keep any secrets. I will guarantee you that that's nonsense. I've helped keep secrets. I had a clearance for 14 years. It's easy to keep secrets. And I'll tell you, once you get a security clearance, they put the fear of God into you. Keep your damn mouth shut. That's basically what it boils down to. Or you will pay a penalty. And that's not a $50 fine. Now, I've got a good bit of time today, and I do want to leave some time for questions at the end. But I'll try to lead you past some evidence that you may not have seen before. You haven't seen it here, because I haven't been here, so... let's see. I have a book by that title, and I must apologize. I don't have any books for sale, because they're all sold. First day of the conference, all the books I brought, I didn't bring enough, obviously, were sold out. But I have a free list of books at my vendor table, and you can get them, and all the ones that I mail out are autographed personally by me. I'm a one-man operation. People are surprised when I answer my phone. What do you think, I got a big corporation behind me? Not me. So that's one of the books, covers the waterfront on the subject. Now, evidence. It's funny how all the debunkers ignore the biggest study of flying saucers ever done. And it was done by the Air Force, or for the Air Force anyway. Project Blue Book, Special Report number 14. Now, unfortunately, the report itself wasn't really distributed. Instead, the Air Force in 1955 put out a press release in which they lied. I mean, I know that's inconceivable that a government agency would lie, but they did. This is a privately published version of this, thanks to Dr. Leon Davidson. That is not a photograph, that's a drawing made for introducing the subject. This study was completed in 1955. This is the third edition, 1966. Here's what the government said about this study. This press release got very wide distribution around the world. It was a little peculiar. It didn't give the title of the report. This study. Now, surely the press, if they had said Blue Book Special Report 14, would have said, hey, what happened to the other 13? We've never heard anything about them. So they didn't give a title. It didn't say who did the work. So there's no place a newspaper man or woman could have gone to say, tell me more about this. The work was done at Battelle Memorial Institute in Columbus, Ohio. Still in existence, runs a lot of the national labs. It's a major corporation. The work was done by scientists there. But Battelle isn't mentioned and no names are mentioned, strangely. And the press release didn't quote the important data. Isn't that amazing? Well, not really, if your intent is to make things unclear as to what's really going on. Now, here's what the Secretary of the Air Force, no higher authority than that, said. On the basis of this study, we believe that no objects such as those popularly described as flying saucers have overflown the United States. I feel certain that even the unknown 3% could have been explained as conventional phenomena or illusions if more complete observational data had been obtained. Well, that takes care of it, doesn't it? Just 3%, nothing to worry about, folks. That's what we were told. The reality is rather different. Here's the breakdown of 3,200 sightings. This is not just a handful of cases. The ones we're interested in, of course, are the unknowns. The bottom line, the unknowns. 3%, whoops, sorry, the unknowns were 21.5%. That's not 3 rounded off where I come from, anyway. And you'll notice the next to the last line, insufficient information. By definition, if there wasn't enough data available about a sighting, it absolutely could not be listed as an unknown. Appropriately enough, it had to be listed as insufficient information. That's not what the Air Force said, of course, but that's what the facts show. Now, you can see these others here. The ones we're interested in are the unknowns. And they've never revised this. It's a constant theme. There's just a few percent, and that's just because there wasn't enough data. They did do something else in the study. They did a quality evaluation of all those sightings, depending on the background of the observer, the circumstances, the duration, you know, the stuff that would tell you something about how good is this case. And there's the quality evaluation. Now, if there's nothing to flying saucers, you'd expect that the better the quality of the sighting, the less likely it would be listed as an unknown, right? Because there's nothing to this subject. Well, sorry. Of the best cases, the excellent ones, top line here, 35% were unknown, and only 3.9% were insufficient information. You go to the poor cases, only 18% were unknown, only. And you notice the higher percentage of insufficient information, 19.6. In other words, very straightforwardly, the better the quality of the sighting, the more likely to be unexplainable, which is exactly what you'd expect if you're dealing with a real phenomenon. You'd never know that from the Air Force, of course. These data are in the report. They're easy to find. And I found them, it was an epiphany for me. I'd read 10 books about flying saucers, and I was at the University of California, Berkeley Library, and son of a gun, here was this new report, Blue Book Special Report 14. And I was surprised because I'd read 10 books and none of them had mentioned it. I'd seen no reference to it. Where did this come from, you know? As it happens, I knew something about Patel Memorial Institute. I made visits there and I had a high respect for their people. So first we find there's plenty of unknowns, not a mere 3%. 35% of the best cases could not be explained. Second, we find the poorer the quality, the more likely to be listed as insufficient information. Again, exactly what you'd expect. So you have this, but the guys who did this study asked an obvious question. Is there really any difference between the unknowns and the knowns? Maybe we just missed the boat in this screening process. Let's do a statistical cross comparison based on 6 different items. apparent size, color, shape, speed, that sort of thing, duration of observation. What they found, the probability that the unknowns were just missed knowns was less than 1%. So this selection, this sorting and sifting, resulted in a body of cases that weren't like the ones that could be identified. You'd think that was important, but of course it isn't mentioned in the press release. And actually it's kind of pushed aside in the report itself. So this report, plus the press release, made me angry, frankly. I'd had a clearance for several years. I'm accustomed to sometimes you have to tiptoe around the truth a little bit when you're dealing with classified information. But outright lying like this makes me angry. I'm a tax-paying citizen, 2 countries. But there's something wrong here. So that I joined APRO and NICAP, the 2 big organizations back in the 60s, to get their newsletters, to find out what's going on. Talked about it at lunch with my professional colleagues, and was really digging into this. And I didn't set out to be a ufologist. I didn't set out to be a speaker about flying saucers. It just happened. Well, I got into it because I was active in a group in Pittsburgh, Westinghouse's Pittsburgh town. And some of you might be familiar with Frank Edwards' book, his major book was Flying Saucers, Serious Business. Frank was a journalist in Indianapolis. He knew everybody. And I lived in Indianapolis for 3 years working for General Motors. And I called Frank after I read his book. I said, Frank, I want to go public. You know everybody. Give me some names here in Pittsburgh. I introduced him when he spoke in Pittsburgh, so I knew he knew people there. He did. And one of them was a producer for a radio show aptly called Contact. And I called the producer, thinking that as a Westinghouse nuclear physicist in Pittsburgh, those are gold-plated credentials. Ha! Don't call us, we'll call you. I was told. Some impression I made. Strange thing. Less than a month later, I got a call at 6:30. Could I do the Contact show tonight at 7, please? Somebody had canceled at the last minute. And I've often wondered, how many people did they call who said no before they finally got to me? I was probably on the bottom of their list, you know. Well, it happened I lived near the station. So what the heck? I said yes. And that was my first show. And I wasn't as good at dealing with the nasty, noisy negativist then as I am now, but I got a call, probably the next day, from somebody at Westinghouse Astronuclear Lab, a technician. She had a book review club. And she said, Stan, we're reading Frank's book for our book review club. Could you give us a talk? Well, sure. At her house, in her living room. That was my first lecture. And I did that. And I did that radio show again. And I did more talks. And I was beginning to like it. And one day I'm riding to work with a woman named Joanne. She had a PhD from Carnegie Tech. She was a supervisor at Westinghouse. And we both lived downtown. Westinghouse was out in a small town called Large. Don't ask me to explain that. And I'm telling her, gee, I'd like to speak at Carnegie Mellon. She said, did you talk to the dean? I said, no, I talked to Dr. So-and-so and he wasn't interested. She said, Stan, the dean's my husband. He's heard you on the radio. Why don't you give him a call? I did. And he'd love to book me. Gee, that's nice. But he wanted a daytime talk, late afternoon. That meant I'd have to take time off work. That was going to cost me. His last question, we set a date and a time. How much do you want? How about $100? Thinking he'd cut me down to 50, frankly. People don't get paid for speaking, do they? Yeah, they do. He bought the 100. And then because I knew his wife, he told me what he was paying the other speakers in the series. $1,500, $1,700, $1,600. Well, that taught me something. Anyway, the lecture went very well. No noisy negativists there. And he wrote a letter to the agent through whom he had booked the other speakers, saying what a great job I had done. And they booked me for the Engineering Society of Detroit. I mean, I may buy Japanese cars, but I respect the Engineering Society of Detroit. $300 in expenses. Wow. They were sold out 2 weeks in advance for 1,008 people for dinner and a talk, and there wasn't one negative question. I got hooked. Their response was so nice. People were so good, and I had to respect these guys. I couldn't dismiss them as a bunch of little old ladies in tennis shoes or something like that. So I started giving more and more talks. And I got a call one day from a colleague at Los Alamos National Laboratory. Stan, I understand you've been giving talks about flying saucers. Yep. How about speaking to our local section of the American Nuclear Society? Oh, I'd love to. I'm a member. Why not? He says, no, I mean on an expense account. In other words, let Westinghouse pay for you to come out here. I don't make those decisions. I'm in Pittsburgh, he's in New Mexico. So I talked with management and they said yes. They paid the expenses for me to go to New Mexico, not for technical discussions with Los Alamos, to cover it up a little bit, to give a lecture, flying saucers are real. And we had well over 400 people, no negative questions. They wrote me a lovely letter. I was hooked. And then things happen to scientists. You lose your job. We had the most successful nuclear rocket test ever, and they canceled the program. And I needed a job. And I was looking around, and I'd made contact with somebody at McDonnell Douglas in California. And I went for a job interview, and they offered me a job doing the most incredibly ideal job for me. My job would be to find out how flying saucers work. That's a challenge and exciting. I mean, I'd worked on nuclear airplanes, I worked on nuclear rockets. Let's put it to use. So I'm driving across the country, and I hear on the radio that the Manned Orbiting Laboratory program was canceled. They were the ones that were going to pay my salary. I walk in, and she says, you realize we just laid off 5,000 people. Yes, I've heard that. They kept me for 3 months. They were nice. Well, they had to do something. I had an offer letter, But that taught me a lesson. If I'm going to take care of my family and do what needs to be done, I got to be responsible for it. So I started calling colleges, and I'm a cheapskate. I was in California, call before 8 in the morning, call back east, cheap rates, etc. I'd book a few talks, I'd do a mailing to 1,000 colleges, get a few more piggyback talks, and I was on my way. That was in 1970. I don't do mailings anymore, but I managed to keep things going. Had some great experiences, and I'm still giving lectures. But I want to disabuse anybody from the notion of, well, everybody knows flying saucers are nonsense. That's not true. In over 700 lectures now, and as you heard, in 50 states, 10 provinces, and 19 other countries, I've had 11 hecklers, and 2 of them were drunk, and the audience took care of the rest. It's okay to believe in flying saucers, believe it or not. And the polls support that. There are more believers than non-believers. Although one of the big debunkers once said the ratio of believers to non-believers is 3 to 11. It's more like 7 to 3. Maybe 8 to 3, depending on where you are and who you're talking to. So this was an important part of raising the questions. What's the data? And this is from an unbiased source. These aren't a bunch of believers. This isn't a UFO organization. It's a top-notch technological organization. Okay. A couple other sources of information. On the left, the UFO evidence put together by the old NICAP. What was it, 2,500 cases or so? All kinds of charts, tables, graphs, and maps. On the right, it may surprise you to know, Symposium on Unidentified Flying Objects, hearings before the Committee on Science and Astronautics, House of Representatives, congressional hearings. They held them on my birthday, July 29, 1958. 6 scientists testified in person, 6 more of us in writing only. I was one of the latter group of 6. I was the youngest presenter and the only one who's still alive. I'm an ornery cuss, so we're going to keep at it, you know. But excellent papers by scientists, several astronomers even. But it's funny, when the astronomers attack ufology, they never talk about this presentation or the professional speakers. Basic rules: don't bother me with the facts, my mind's made up. That's debunker rule number 1. Number 2, what the public doesn't know, we're not going to tell them. Put out false and misleading operation. Nobody will know the difference anyway, you know. So, this is the famous or infamous University of Colorado study, the Condon report. They spent $539,000. Our money, incidentally. It's well over 800 pages. And if you read the press release in in 1969, scientific study shows no UFOs. That was the malarkey that was put out in the press release. On the other hand, the public never heard from a special subcommittee of the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, world's largest group of space scientists. They had a special UFO subcommittee. They wouldn't let me on the committee because I had taken a stand. After 11 years of investigation, you'd think I would take a stand, but they concluded that one could come to the opposite conclusions from Dr. Condon's based on the data in the report. Any phenomena with 30% unknowns is worthy of further investigation. You didn't hear about that from the major media, even the minor media for that matter. I had some contact with Condon, and I've just written a new book with Kathleen Martin here about fact, fiction, and flying saucers, and some of the fiction was put out by Dr. Condon. He said, there's no chance of any alien visiting Earth in the next 10,000 years. 10,000 years! My God, what a predictive capability he has. Any evidence to support that? Of course not. But don't bother me with the facts, my mind's made up. And we're still puzzling over why was Condon so negative. He was an outstanding scientist. Now, he did have some security problems early in his time in industry. And it may be that somebody was able to say, either you cooperate with us and get the desired results, or you're going to have a serious problem. I don't know. If any of you knows, I'd like to hear about it. Dr. J. Allen Hynek's book. It's amazing how often the SETI cultists, as I call them, you know what SETI is, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. My definition is silly effort to investigate. Well, it's kind of crazy. Somehow, aliens out there are trying to send us messages using techniques which are compatible with ours. Now, how would they know what those are? Well, you could say, well, they'd go there and find out, but no. They're not allowing anybody to come here. They're sending signals. And if we keep listening vigorously enough, strongly enough, often enough, in enough places, we'll get a message and it'll be the greatest point of time in man's history, contact with others. Do we want to look at the UFO data? Of course not. If they're coming here, who needs to listen with radio telescopes? Learn sign language. That would be a better approach. So they never look at Allen Hynek's book. He was a professor of astronomy, chairman of the astronomy department at Northwestern University, and for 19 years, the Air Force consultant on Project Blue Book. 19 years. And he was called in with the tough cases, swamp gas in Michigan and some other ones. But it's funny how they ignore the work by the other astronomer who's looked at the data. Now, I know how ignorant people are, because when I ask, and I'm not asking tonight because I know you're not ignorant, I have asked at many a lecture, after each of those sources of data, how many of you have read this? And I'm lucky if I get 2% who've read any of them. So, I don't care about opinions based on belief systems and not on evidence, data, solid information like these studies. Okay. Now, everybody knows you can't get here from there. There are many components of that. First of all, you'd have to come from hundreds of light years away, or thousands. Frank Drake was talking about there might be a civilization as close as 1,000 light years. Wow. And Jill Tarter, an outstanding SETI scientist, said when we make contact, it'll be the greatest event in man's history. How useful it would be for us. They're 1,000 light years away. Hey guys, I got a problem. Can you help me? It takes 1,000 years to get out there and another 1,000 years to get the message back. Not much use, I would think, if you got to wait 2,000 years for a response. Now, you're probably all aware that there have been a number of planet hunters, that's a funny term, but looking for planets around the stars. The latest consensus, now if you go back 100 years, there were plenty of people saying we're the only solar system in the whole universe. If there was anybody out there, we would know about it, wouldn't we? They'd want to talk to us, say the astronomers, of course. Now, rough number. The measurements with things like the Kepler space satellite, which is a remarkable little satellite that goes out and back, and it picks up, really amazing. You get a star. You got a planet that goes by the star. And because it's going by, it cuts off the light from the star. So you get a change in the amount of light you receive, a very teeny tiny change. And from that you can determine that there's a planet going by. And maybe 6 or 8 or 9 of them going by. So the latest numbers, and I checked this recently, that there are between 1 and 1.6 planets per star. Maybe as many as 10, maybe as few as 0. But planets are all over the place out there. I'm not saying they all have life, but let's bring that home. Within 100 light years of here, which is just down the street, the galaxy, the Milky Way, is 100,000 light years across and has a couple 100 billion stars. Nobody's counted them all. What difference does it make whether it's 100 billion or 200 billion? The latest numbers are that there's between 1 and 1.6 planets per star. Within 100 light years of here, there are 10,000 stars. 10,000. So that means there's between 10,000 and 16,000 planets within 100 light years. And some of them are awfully darn close. I'll be talking about the Barney Hill star map later. Those two stars are 39.3 light years away. You must have seen recently about a star that's got 9 planets around it, 40 light years away, a different direction from the Hill stars. And we know that many stars have other stars that are very close to them. Everybody knows that the nearest star to the sun is 4.3 light years away. But there are plenty of stars out there that have other neighboring stars less than a light year away. The 2 stars in the Hill map are about 1/8 of a light year apart. That's 35 times closer to each other than we are to the next star over. Doesn't it make sense that the closer the nearest neighbor, the more likely are to go looking to try to develop interstellar travel, check things out, etc.? And it's like if you need a cup of sugar, you look for your next door neighbor, not somebody 10 miles away or 1,000 miles away. You've got to do things that make sense. So the picture has changed drastically, and anybody who tells you, oh, the nearest star from which these guys could come would have to be hundreds or thousands of light years away. That's nonsense. That's plucked out of the air, having no validity at all. And remember, the question is not, do all these planets have life on them? The question is, do any? You know, I'm interested in nuclear fission. 99.3% of uranium atoms are U-238. I want U-235, guys. So in World War II, we spent lots of money to set up a mile-long facility to enrich the uranium. U-235 is a little bit lighter, so it can go a little faster if you pump it as a gas through tiny little holes in nickel sheets in this mile-long facility. A lot of work, but as it goes through, it gets slightly enriched, and you put it back in, and it gets enriched some more, and pretty soon you got pretty hot stuff. We were using over 5% of all the electricity produced in the United States to pump uranium through this gaseous diffusion plant in secret. And it worked. We did it. And electricity was at a premium during World War II. You know, you got to make ammunitions and planes and tanks and ships. It wasn't readily available with nothing to do with it. 5% in secret. That's the important thing. Now, I must say, most people don't appreciate how big research and development programs are. I'll show you a picture of a nuclear aircraft system potential. When I was working at General Electric Aircraft Nuclear Propulsion Department, Cincinnati, its existence was not classified. The data was classified. But on the door it said GEANP. Anyway, our budget in 1958, a long time ago, $100 million. And we employed 3,400 people, of whom 1,100 were engineers and scientists. So we're not talking about 6 professors and 20 grad students. And we never built a nuclear-powered airplane. So you got to spend a lot of dough. That's what it boils down to. Now, what have we learned? Well, look at that monstrosity. Well, it's kind of close to my heart because I worked on the program, but inside this thing here is a nuclear reactor. Aircraft comes from the jet engines, is passed through the reactor, and goes out through the turbine. And that's how you fly a nuclear airplane, if you can get this off the ground, of course, minor detail. It's on a railroad car because it becomes radioactive after a while, and you better be able to move it remotely. You don't want to kill too many people as you're moving this thing around. You know, it's one of those hazards you have to worry about a little bit. That was about 1956. This is what a flight type system would be. Reactor inside, and air coming through the reactor, getting heated, going out through the turbines, and you got thrust. Intriguing concept. They canceled the program. What do you expect? There was a nuclear-powered ramjet. Kiwi, it was called, believe it or not. You know, that's the wingless bird. It didn't get off the ground either. The idea here was to carry this aloft under a B-52. And if you were smart, you could put a couple of H-bombs on it, and you could drop them any place on the planet. It never got off the ground either, but it was important to spend the money to outdo the Russians. I wonder if the Russian engineers were telling their government, we got to spend money to outdo the Americans, you know. What I'm saying is that's a real piece of hardware. This isn't an imaginary concept. Now, the really interesting stuff are the nuclear rocket engines. And there were a lot of people working on these, including me at our system. These are all Los Alamos systems. Here's a man, so you see the relative size of these things. Different power levels. And you may think, well, that's just artist concept. Here's a little more involved one. You get liquid hydrogen, comes in very, very cold, goes around and goes out of the reactor very, very hot. Over 4,000 degrees. 3 different companies built these things. Westinghouse Astronuclear Lab, where I was, Aerojet General, Sacramento, and Los Alamos. They all worked. There's ours, the Westinghouse one. Reactor in here, tested out at the nuclear test site. Power level, this one was 1,100 megawatts. That's half the power of Hoover Dam, which you may realize is a little bit larger than this. Aerojet, this is Los Alamos, one of theirs. The Los Alamos one, about this big. Power level, 4,400 megawatts. Twice the power of Hoover Dam, which is this huge thing out there. Some of you may have been there. And it worked. You don't get close while they're running, and those tanks are tanks of liquid hydrogen. And hydrogen just happens to, fortunately, be the most common element isotope in the universe. Everywhere you go, you're going to find hydrogen. It's also the lightest, which means when you kick it out the back end of the rocket, you get the highest velocity. It's kind of a neat way to go. We all had successful tests. It was a great day in my professional life when this thing ran. We didn't have any idea how long it would run for. 10 minutes before the fuel elements come out the back end. And they were reading off the temperature and the pressure. 10 minutes, 15, everything nominal, 20. It went the full 60 minutes. It was limited by how much hydrogen you could store in the tanks. Met all the goals. Very successful test. Los Alamos successful test. Aerojet successful test. And then, as you naturally expect, they canceled the program. That's when I went to McDonnell Douglas, hopefully of spending my life figuring out how flying saucers work. 3 months later, I'm out on the market again. What I'm saying is we had massive efforts, lots of money here, lots of people, lots of talent, and they worked. And at one time, there was a plan to launch a nuclear rocket as an upper stage on a big rocket. The benefit of this is that you can triple the payload to Mars. All of us working on this stuff back in the 60s thought by the end of the 70s we'd have gone to Mars. And by 2000 we'd have a base on the moon, of course. Plenty of momentum. We had all the capabilities of doing it. But no will. Worst meeting I ever attended in my life, and I attended a lot of bad ones. A meeting at Aerojet, when the NASA Space Nuclear Propulsion Office held a meeting, and I was allowed to go because I was there with my counterpart working on radiation shielding for these things. Purpose of the meeting, what should we do with this nuclear rocket engine? They didn't know what they wanted to do with the darn thing. You don't get money for big programs if you don't have a goal in mind. And they said, well, we could do this, we could do that, the public won't pay for this, Earth orbit, lunar orbit, base on the moon, base on Mars. You need leadership. You need somebody who says, hey, this is where we want to go, let's do it. My ideal leader for this kind of thing is Admiral Hyman Rickover, Navy Admiral, Rear Admiral. And some people hated his guts. This is where we're going. You don't want to go there? Get off the program. We built nuclear submarines. Go around the world underwater without coming to the surface. That's impressive. A World War II submarines could stay under for a day because you need air for the engines on the diesels. We have nuclear ones that can stay under for longer than a year. And that means the other guy doesn't know where you are. So if he's going to bomb you and you have missiles underwater in a submarine whose location you have no idea, he's going to retaliate. Mutually assured destruction. I know it sounds terrible, but it kept the peace. You can't get me without me getting you, so it makes no sense. So let's a standoff, you know. The Navy has nuclear aircraft carriers, which you better understand can operate for 18 years without refueling. That's very impressive to me. Ask any ship captain, 18 years for this mammoth aircraft carrier without having a tanker there? Wow. Changes everything. If you don't need to go to the gas station, in other words, to refuel. So we've made enormous strides here. Many people, I'm not just boosting nuclear because I'm a nuclear physicist, but it is truly impressive to me that you can have a big ship go for 18 years without refueling. That's impressive. Now, the real beauty is nuclear fusion. Now you say, so who cares about fusion? What's all that about? Well, it happens to be the most important source of energy in all your lives. The sun and all the other stars produce their energy not by burning gas, but by nuclear fusion reactions. And we thought it was by burning gas in the 1920s. We discovered fission and fusion in 1938. And boy, does that make a difference. In terms of power per unit volume, per unit weight, whatever you want. Now, there's an interesting sequence here. In 1944, a powerful bomb was a 10-ton blockbuster. Released the energy of 10 tons of TNT. Dynamite, if you want to call it that. That was in 44. The first atomic bomb in 1945 released the energy of 16,000 tons of TNT. Not 16 tons, 16,000 tons. That was nuclear fission, atomic bomb, if you want. 1952, we had our first fusion device. Released the energy of 10 million tons of TNT. The Russians, a few years later, set off one that released the energy of 57 million tons of TNT. One stinking bomb. Think about that for a minute. Now, there's an implication here, which I haven't brought up, but I'm getting close to. You can use fission or fusion for propulsion. I was involved in a study of nuclear fusion for deep space travel in 1962, when I was a wee broth of a lad, yes. And our conclusion was a $9 million contract with the Air Force at Aerojet General Nucleonics, under the direction of the man who handled the fusion work at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, I might add. And the conclusion of our study was, yes, if you want to go to the stars using nuclear fusion, you can. It's just going to take a lot of money. A very great deal of money. So you have to decide it's something you want to do. And it does seem to me reasonable, if you're going to send a starship out, it should represent the planet. But who speaks for planet Earth? We got a bunch of countries. We don't have an Earthling society to send out a fusion rocket. But these are the fusion reactions. Don't let the equations bother you. Helium, heavy hydrogen, deuterium it's called. The important thing here is this number, 18.3 million electron volts. Normal chemical reactions give you 5, 10, 20 electron volts. These fusion reactions give you 18 million electron volts. Big difference. Now, what's important here is not only for bombs, of course, but you could use it to go to the stars. Take a lot of money to build useful systems. It may be that our visiting aliens don't want us to go to the stars. If you were an alien, would you want us out there? The military budget on Earth this year is $1 trillion. And lots of kids died of starvation yesterday, and the day before, and the day before that, and tomorrow, and the next day. I think from an alien viewpoint, we're a primitive society whose major activity is tribal warfare. Look how we behave. $1 trillion on things military when there are starving kids? Does that make any sense for a civilized planet? I don't think so. But what I'm saying is, the most important source of energy in the entire universe is nuclear fusion. And it can be used for bombs, which we have done. And remember, we have exploded 2,000 nuclear warheads on planet Earth. That's what we do. Bigger bombs, better bombs, more powerful bombs. But it can take you to the stars as well. So, it's kind of a crazy situation here, isn't there? If I were an alien, I'd say quarantine the guys on that planet. And maybe some of you have heard of what happened at Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana when 10 missiles went offline with nuclear warheads on them when UFOs showed up at the door. And I've talked to the man who was there, down in the hole. It can't happen, but it did. And it happened in Russia, too. I think somebody's sending us a message. Hey, you idiots. Take it from there. So, and you'll notice that it says charged particles. If you use charged particles, you can direct their path out the back end with electric and magnetic fields. If they're neutrons, they go off in all directions. How do you get thrust out of that? So this is a whole new world for most people. I mean, no, you can't go to a big company and buy one of these systems. But if we want to go to the stars, and if the planet decides we should go to stars and is willing to pay for it, it can be done. I don't think we're ready to go, but that's another story. Okay. Never mind the saucer. Did you see the guys who were driving? Does a nuclear physicist believe in little green men? Well, they are little. Whether they're men or women, we don't know. They're not green. Sorry. Yeah, we have not only observations of creatures, aliens, call them what you want, but of craft on the ground. Some people will tell you, oh, UFOs, those are strange lights in the sky. Who knows what they are? Not worth bothering about. Well, there's a man named Ted Phillips in Missouri who's collected more than 4,000 physical trace cases from more than 80 countries. These are reports where the object is seen on or near the ground, and after it leaves, one finds physical changes, the equivalent of burn circles, burn rings, landing gear marks, footprints. About 6% at least of these cases involve reports of beings associated with the craft. Little guys, if you want. Typically shorter than us. Probably smarter. Here's a typical physical trace case. Doesn't look like much. Here's the ring of soil. Ronnie Johnson, age 17, was off to the left here, 50 feet. Doing his chores for the evening, looks up, and here's this object, maybe 10 feet in diameter, sitting just above the ground, glowing at the bottom. He's paralyzed, can't move. This thing takes off. Moves away slowly, dashes into the house, tells his parents he just saw a flying saucer. They laugh at him. You don't need to believe me. Go outside and you can see it. And they did go out and they did see it moving slowly away. They called the sheriff, who came out, checked for radiation. That's what everybody worries about, you know. Didn't find any. Ted Phillips heard about this case. He's in Missouri. This is in Delphos, Kansas, not too far away from here. I've been there. Ted got samples, ran tests. That's ring soil on the right. Ted sent me samples. I hope you appreciate that sophisticated soil retention device up there. Ring soil on the right. Control sample from nearby on the left. I had good tests done by a soil testing lab. It was funny, I called 3 different labs in California. Who's the best lab to do soil testing? Because Ted found that this stuff wouldn't grow anything. Tried planting seeds, you know, and the ring soil wouldn't grow anything. It turns out there's a higher level of soluble minerals. It's too salty to grow anything, if you will. So we have lots of cases like this. Now, not only do we have cases like this, saucers seen on or near the ground, but sometimes they pick up specimens. This is the famous Betty and Barney Hill case. There's Betty on the right, Barney on the left. The dog was with them. He wasn't involved in the activities. Well, he didn't chase the aliens, as far as we know. And this happened in 1961. And it was never expected that this case would go public. Anyway, Betty and Barney were driving along in New Hampshire, saw something strange in the sky. This is a condensed version of the case. We have a whole book, which I can't sell you because I don't have any copies with me, but you can order it by mail, autographed. They saw this strange craft in the sky, came closer, came a lot closer. It was less than 100 feet, or roughly 100 feet away from the craft. Barney got out of the car, looking at this thing. Double row of windows, and inside he sees beings. Scares the hell out of him. He thinks he's going to be captured. That's what goes on in his head. He dashes back to the car, drives off. They run across some beings in the road up ahead. Things go blank. They reawaken, if you will, and it's 2 hours late when they get home. And they have no recollection of what happened in that period of time. And they seem to have some medical problems. And Barney, the doctor, he was developing ulcers, and the doctor figured there was some psychological problem here. I think you ought to see a psychiatrist, Barney. So they did, because, ulcers, psychological, et cetera, et cetera. And they fortunately wound up with an outstanding specialist, not on flying saucers. Dr. Benjamin Simon was one of the world's top experts on what do I call it? Missing time experience, where something happened. People who have traumatic experiences, post-traumatic stress disorder. Dr. Simon was an expert on that. He ran an army hospital during the war, 3,000 beds, because a lot of soldiers come back seriously in trouble. Your buddy's head gets blown off next to you. That's hard to handle. Why him, not me, et cetera, et cetera. So he worked out the definitive techniques for dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder, using hypnosis to relive the experience and incorporate the findings into their personality, and they're no longer blind or whatever the problem was that was created. Dr. Simon didn't know anything about flying saucers, but he hypnotized each of them separately. Neither one knew what the other one was saying. He taped everything. And there was a 6-month period where he did weekly sessions. And it was amazing what came out. I should add, Betty was a social worker with the state of New Hampshire. Barney worked for the post office, so it was on the Governor's Civil Rights Commission. These were respectable people and courageous people. You can see in 1960s, a black man and a white woman was a courageous act, not very common at that time. And there were states where that was illegal. Pretty special people. And yes, I've met them. I don't say that casually, in other words. And Betty's niece, Kathleen Marden, did most of the work on the book we wrote about this. She's here. Intriguing thing. Betty, under hypnosis, is describing what's going on board the craft, and she said the leader of this group of small aliens, for want of a better word, call them whatever you want, showed her a star map. She asked him, Betty would ask anybody anything. She had guts. Social workers, I guess, have to, because they deal with some very strange processes of human behavior. And the guy shows her a star model map, whatever you want to call it. And Dr. Simon sensibly asked Betty if she can remember what it looked like. And she says yes. So he gives her a post-hypnotic suggestion. Draw it later on, if and only if you can remember it accurately. This sticking to what's real is a very important part of this kind of post-hypnotic stuff. And so she drew this map on the left. These are base stars, trade routes, occasional expeditions. And there's a little problem with this map. What the heck does it mean? We got no reference points. And Betty asked the leader, where are you on the map? Wise guy alien says, do you know where you are? I don't know anything about astronomy, she says. Well, how can I tell you where I'm at or where I'm from if you don't know where you're at? End of discussion. Dr. Simon doesn't have any idea what's going on here, but she draws the map, and it's published in the book, and it looked hopeless. We'll never figure out what it means, if it means anything. Well, we did. Marjorie Fish read the book, met with Betty, brilliant woman, a third grade school teacher at the time, but a member of Mensa. She figured she'd build the model and see if she could find a three-dimensional pattern that matched the two-dimensional drawing that Betty had made. Sounds easy. It's not. Her first model had 256 stars in it. That means you need 3 coordinates to get them in the right place. These are beads hung on fish line. And you walk around and you try to find a pattern that matches this drawing you've got. You don't know anything about what's in it. I mean, a reasonable presumption might be that the sun is in it because they're here. But, you know, where, which, how? Anyway, Marjorie built a total of over 20 three-dimensional models, gradually eliminating stars. And she found a pattern that matched. She's also a good sculptress. You can tell how old this picture is by the color of my beard, I guess. Long time ago. This is one of her models, 256 stars in there. Awful lot of work, dedication, concern, and other people have looked at her work, said it was accurate. The head of the astronomy department at Ohio State University let her copy numbers from the catalogs. They wouldn't let her take out the catalogs from the library. She had to copy out all the coordinates, the angles, and distance. The problem was the distance data. Nobody's going anywhere. Who cares how far away they are? If you want to aim a telescope, it's just 2 coordinates and away you go. But if you want to build a three-dimensional pattern, you have to know how far. So getting good distance data was difficult. Now, since that time, the Hipparcos satellite was launched and measured the distances to thousands and thousands of stars. But then that wasn't available. Anyway, she finally found one pattern that matched angle for angle, line length for line length, what Betty had drawn. It was a triumphant moment, to say the least. Incidentally, this is the sun. Here are the base stars. These are the names of the stars from an old version. Sun, our star. And those distances are light years, LY, 36.6. Now we know it's 39 light years away. Just down the street, around the corner. This is not millions of light years or across the galaxy. And if they're coming here, then you'd expect it to be the local neighborhood kind of thing. And the base stars, Zeta 1 and Zeta 2 reticuli. What does that mean? Well, the constellation of Reticulum. It's a southern sky constellation. Can't see it from here. You've got to go below the equator. And that happens to be, those 2 stars happen to be the closest to each other pair of sun-like stars in our entire local neighborhood, which is kind of amazing. And it turns out that the base stars, the pattern stars, are in a plane. Think of a thin pizza with pieces of pepperoni on it, instead of raisins in a loaf of raisin bread in all directions, you know. And it turns out that makes it a lot easier to travel. The planets in the solar system are all in a plane, which is kind of neat. So I was the first to publish about this work in Saga magazine. I hope some of you remember Saga magazine a long time ago. But it was an exciting piece of work. And Marjorie wound up, through some people I know, being a technician at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, and she spent 20 years there. Bright gal, very successful career. She's deceased now. I published the article and I convinced the editor of Astronomy magazine to do a study on her, Terence Dickinson. I had met him when I was traveling and so forth. And he talked to a bunch of people and he did an article, got more response than anything they'd ever published at Astronomy magazine. And over the next years, this is in the early 70s, he published a dozen letters or so. Then he put together a 32-page full-color booklet, and they immediately sold more than 10,000 copies. It's unheard of for an astronomical publication. And then Carl Sagan, my University of Chicago classmate for 3 years, his lawyer threatened to sue them because Carl's name was on there as one of many people who made comments. They made me an offer I couldn't refuse, and I wound up with 16,000 copies of this, all long gone. And if I had another 16,000, I'd be able to sell them too. I wish I had, but I don't. But it's an exciting piece of work, and it focuses the attention on the local neighborhood, and it shows how a brilliant woman, Marjorie, using basically simple techniques, was able to develop some very good information. And her work's been looked at by a lot of people. I talked to Dr. Mitchell at Ohio State University, he's the head of the astronomy department, and he had good things to say about Marjorie's work. He had his students check. It was accurate. Alan Hynek had a couple of his students check her work. It was accurate. Dr. David Saunders, who worked on the Condon study, checked her work. It was accurate. So it's an exciting, it's a whole new direction for this kind of work. And I'd say you want to go someplace out there, try Zeta Reticuli. It's only 39 light years away. Incidentally, people say how long it would take you. Take an awful long time. Well, not really. At 1g acceleration, the force of gravity right here, right now, it takes less than a year to get to the speed of light. And people want half an Einstein. In other words, the speed of light's a limit. But the other half is, as you get close to the speed of light, time slows down for things moving that fast. Don't ask me why. That's the way God created the universe, is the simplest answer. But at 99.99% of the speed of light, you can go 39 light years in 6 months, pilot time. You go out, come back, marry your granddaughter's best friend, and, you know, time slows down for things moving that fast. And you say, well, yeah, but we don't know how to get close to the speed of light. Well, the Large Hadron Collider, the LHC over there in Switzerland, on the border, it accelerates particles in it 99.9999% of the speed of light. So this is not an unheard of realm, in other words. It's not easy, and you and I can't do it at the moment, but it's reachable. So this is an exciting piece of work. 39 light years, no big deal, I guess. Here's what those aliens look like. Little gray guys, call them what you want. Kathleen, in my book, she did most of the work. Captured. There was another book, Interrupted Journey, way back in the mid-60s. This updates it to much more recently than that. Raises interesting questions. Now we get to Roswell. Some people call me Mr. Roswell. Well, it's Mr. Friedman. I was the original civilian investigator of the Roswell incident. Was I there when it happened in July 1947? No, I was only 13 that year. I had my bar mitzvah in July. I wasn't investigating UFOs. And I found out about this just by being in the right place at the right time and asking a question. And I mention this only because people say, well, why did somebody talk to you? How did you know about this? Blah, blah, blah. I was in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, to give a lecture at Louisiana State University. And the students brought me to the television station in town. This is 1978. And I was supposed to do 3 interviews to promote the lecture that night. And I'd done the first 2, and the third reporter was nowhere to be found. People didn't have cell phones back then. So the station manager's giving me coffee. He's looking at his watch. He knew I had other things to do, and he had other things. He didn't want to lose the interview. And out of the blue, he said something that changed my life. He said, the guy you ought to talk to is Jesse Marcel. Brilliant investigator that I am, I said, who's he? He handled wreckage of one of those saucers you're interested in when he was in the military. What? Where did that come from? He wasn't joking. There wasn't anybody around. He wasn't laughing or anything like that. Turned out he'd seen the article about the Roswell incident in the New Orleans Times-Picayune newspaper. And back then, if you mentioned a military guy, you often put in his hometown, from Homa. And so I asked, well, what do you know about him? Well, we're old ham radio buddies. He's from Homa. That didn't tell me a darn thing, because I didn't know where Homa was. I've been there since to talk to Jesse, of course. He's a great guy. You ought to talk to him. Okay. So I was busy the rest of the day. The reporter finally showed up, and I was busy. Everything went very well, so it gave me a good feeling. And I was at the airport early, and I used an old device. I called information to get a number for Jesse. No computers back then to look things up the easy way, you know. And they had a number for Jesse A. Marcel in Homa, wherever it was. And I called and explained that I was a nuclear physicist who had a security clearance and so forth. Was very interested, and I'd been talking to Bill Allen at the television station. And so he told me a story. And people said, well, why did he talk to you? Well, I found out later his name was in newspapers all over the world. He could hardly say he had nothing to do with this. His picture was in many papers. I didn't know that at the time, you understand. This is 1978. We're talking about 1947 was when the event took place. So that got me started. And with a colleague in the next year, we found 60 people connected with Roswell. And one of the important things is Roswell was a very special place. Not because they have a UFO museum, which they didn't at the time. It was special because it was the home of the 509th Composite Bomb Group, the only atomic bombers in the entire world. They dropped the bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, exploded 2 more at Operation Crossroads in 1946. The Russians didn't have one until 1949. All had high-level security clearances. And why in New Mexico? I had one English astronomer say, there's nothing in New Mexico. Why would anybody go there? I said, you ever been there? No, but all there is sand, isn't there? I said, well, perhaps you don't know that 2 of the 3 nuclear weapons labs in the United States are in New Mexico. That's where we're firing captured German V-2 rockets. And the first nuclear weapon was tested there in New Mexico, Trinity Site. And one of the reasons for these things is that there's nobody there, a lot of empty land. It's safe to test a nasty weapon and fire rockets when there are very few people around. And the government had the right to kick ranchers off their ranches when they were running certain kinds of tests. So New Mexico makes sense. If there was any spy around trying to find out what was going on, New Mexico would be one of the places you'd go. So we found over 60 people within a year. First book came out in 1980. Many more since. Talked to lots of people. I think I have, yeah. Army finds air saucer on ranch in New Mexico. This goes to high officers. That's July 8th, 1947. It's a long, involved story. Just about all the original witnesses are dead. Not surprisingly, this is 70 years later now. And you figure most of them had to be 18 at the time this happened if they were at the base. A significant event. We recovered the wreckage of a crashed flying saucer, which means we got technical information. What's it made out of? Not necessarily how does it work, because we may not be smart enough to figure that out. But certainly, it was not technical data that we wanted to share with anybody. I think you can understand that. The first country to duplicate the behavior of flying saucers is going to rule the planet. So we're not going to put what we know out on the table so the Russians or Chinese or whatever can put it together with what they know. That's a serious national security problem. So Roswell, last year, to give you some idea of the interest in the subject of Roswell, the International UFO Museum and Research Center there last year had 204,000 visitors. And Roswell isn't on the way to anywhere. It's 200 miles from Albuquerque, 200 miles from El Paso, 200 miles from Amarillo. If you're there, it's because you want to be there. It's a destination. People bring their kids there. I'll be there again for the 70th anniversary. They usually invite me to be there. Sign books, talk to witnesses, talk to visitors. They come from all over the world. And like I say, 204,000 in this little town out and away from anywhere makes a major contribution to the economy, and that seems appropriate. You see, the 509, the base, Roswell Army Airfield, Lyndon Johnson decided to close it because New Mexico didn't vote for him in the 1964 election. So they were punished for no good reason at all. They had this 15,000-foot runway. The German Air Force used to fly missions from there because it's out in the middle of nowhere and safe to fly a lot of airplane missions. And where did he move it? Texas, of course. So it seems quite appropriate to me that Roswell benefited from this great influx of visitors, and they're there because the government was covering things up. They gave 4 explanations for Roswell. Flying saucer, that's what the headline said. And then, just radar reflector weather balloon combination. And then a mogul balloon explanation. And then people were talking about bodies. We found out what they were, the Air Force says. Crash test dummies that we were dropping all over New Mexico. And they showed the same map 3 times. None of the locations were anywhere near where the Roswell saucer was recovered, of course. And the mummies weren't dropped until 6 years after Roswell, but people's memories weren't good. I mean, this is the government that is ruling us, can't come up with something better than that? Like the truth. No, that's too much to expect. And that is not Royal Australian Air Force, RAAF, that's Roswell Army Airfield. Captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region. And I had one guy who got elected to Congress, mind you, on a television station say, well, couldn't have been much of a story, it was only in the Roswell paper. Oh, really? Yeah, the other one was the Chicago paper. Not a small town newspaper. That's the state of New Mexico. Roswell is down in the lower right-hand corner here. This is White Sands Missile Range, the yellow area here. In Albuquerque are the nuclear weapons labs. And you can see that Roswell isn't on the way to anywhere. But they come. There's Major Jesse Marcel. He's the guy I talked to. And then I found out his picture was in the paper, so we dug out the papers, and this picture was taken at Fort Worth. The wreckage was taken there. And that picture was in China and all kinds of other places. Well, it was kind of a shocking thought. Flying disc recovered in New Mexico? Wow. There's General Roger Ramey on the left and Thomas Jefferson Dubose on the right. Ramey was head of the 8th Air Force, under which was the 509th. He was based in Texas. The wreckage was carried there. They took these pictures. All phony wreckage, had nothing to do with what was recovered. They got away with it. Lies work. Why are they lying? It works. Takes away the attention for something that you don't want anybody to know anything about. I located General Dubose. I figured, I saw the picture, and I knew Ramey was dead, and the head of the base was dead, Blanchard, and a number of other people were dead. But I thought maybe Dubose is still alive. So I figured he was, as an officer in 1947, most of the officers who stayed in after the war was over were West Pointers. Makes sense. So I called West Point alumni. Yes, he's still alive. It's in Florida. They wouldn't tell me what city, but with a name like Thomas Jefferson Dubose, easy to find. I called him, talked to him, met with him. He told me, standing 3 feet away, he took the call for Ramey's boss, from Ramey's boss, giving him 3 instructions. This is General McMullen. Get the press off our back. I don't care how you do it. I don't want you to ever talk about it again, was the primary instruction. And so he told me this firsthand. This isn't third hand. Good man, Tommy. Oh, if you look back at that picture, Ramey is holding this piece of paper in his hand. And because that picture was taken with a speed graphic, very good resolution camera, people with modern techniques are able to read this. It's an early version, and it talks about victims of the wreck. Now, obviously, weather balloons have victims of the wreck, don't they? There's Tommy. You can see how long ago it was taken. Great guy. The officers at Roswell were top-notch. They had to be. The only atomic bombers in the world. High-level security clearances, extremely competent people. Harassed rancher who located saucer, sorry he told about it. In the last paragraph, I'm sure what I found was not any weather observation balloon, he said, but if I find anything else besides a bomb, they're going to have a hard time getting me to say anything about it. He was detained, the officer, or the rancher, and, read the Riot Act, keep your damn mouth shut. He may have gotten enough money to buy a business that he was suddenly in. That's another story. We'll talk about that. Or we won't talk about it here. Then the Air Force put out the Roswell report, case closed. And they said in their first report, they're not going to say anything more about Roswell. A year later, they put out a full report, lying through their teeth. Now, crash test dummies. The one in the middle is the dummy. I met with the man on the right, Colonel Madsen. He was in charge of the crash test dummy program. You notice that the dummy is in Air Force gear. You say, why? Well, the purpose of these dummies, you kick them out of an airplane at 40,000 feet. And the question was, how long before you open the parachute? You don't want to freeze to death before you get down. So it was meaningful tests, and you don't run pilots, you run dummies, And he told me that the special thing about, when they said crash test dummies, everybody reported the bodies were small beings, maybe 4 feet or so. The crash test dummies, and he told me this, were all 6 feet tall and 175 pounds. They were wooden dummies. And often when they hit the ground, the arms fell off, the legs fell off. You can understand at 40,000 feet, dropping. But it's funny, the Air Force didn't talk to him. I had no trouble finding him. The New York Times had the story. Crash test dummies. They didn't talk to him. Incompetent media? Call it what you want, I guess. Oh yes. Then we have the infamous MJ-12, Majestic 12. We got a roll of film with document on it. Briefing document for Operation Majestic 12, prepared for President-elect Dwight D. Eisenhower, eyes only, 18 November 1952. Ike was elected early in November 52, took office in January of 53. And we know that on this date he was briefed on national security matters. I found the documents talking about that. And what this document says is, in 1947, President Truman established this group called Operation Majestic 12, whose purpose it was to find out about flying saucers after the Roswell incident. They had 12 people on this committee, that's why Majestic 12, and they were outstanding. 6 were military, 6 were scientists. 5 were scientists, and the other was Secretary of Defense Forrestal. And it named the people, and of course you have a little question, are the documents legitimate? That names the people. You notice top secret magic, eyes only. We're getting pretty hot stuff here. Here's the names of the people. You might recognize some of them. Forrestal, General Twining, General Vandenberg. Outstanding people. But there's one surprise. Dr. Donald Menzel here was a Harvard University professor of astronomy. Now, all these other people, it was easy to establish, had high-level security clearances because of the jobs they held and stuff like that. But Menzel's outstanding characteristics, besides being an astronomer, he was violently anti-UFO. He wrote 3 debunking books, gave talks, always said there's nothing to it. You don't need a high-level security clearance to teach astronomy at Harvard, as far as I know, anyway. So this posed a puzzle. How could I go public with something and then have somebody say, hey, you fell for that, didn't you? I made it up. Well, I was looking at the other members of the committee, and in Dr. Bush's papers, I found a letter from an attorney in Boston thanking Dr. Bush, who headed many scientific research and development groups and boards and stuff, telling Dr. Bush, thanks for your help in getting Dr. Menzel cleared of charges of disloyalty to the government and wanting to withdraw his high-level security clearance. What? Where'd that come from? So I called the attorney, and he said, oh yeah, there are about 1,000 pages at the Harvard archives about those hearings. Would you believe the New York Times and the Washington Post had nothing? And they were talking about communists under every bed all the time. This is 1950. So I had to get permission from 3 different people to look at Menzel's papers at Harvard, written permission, which I did, and I got a grant from the Fund for UFO Research, and I went to Harvard. And I had had one run-in with Menzel. I didn't like the man. And didn't know where to look. I knew some of his UFO stuff. I was at the American Philosophical Society Library in Philadelphia. What am I going to look at? There was a folder, JFK. What's Menzel doing with John F. Kennedy? Pay dirt. Open it up. Well, it turns out, a little background here, Menzel, Kennedy was on the Board of Overseers at Harvard before he became president. And his area of interest, every member of the board looked at one particular area, was astronomy. And so he worked with Donald Menzel. And they often had breakfast together. Kennedy had an office in Boston, that's not far. And so I'm looking at these papers and holy cow. There's a letter from Menzel to President Kennedy. First name basis. And there's one area where I may be of assistance to you. That's with regard to the National Security Agency, where the previous administration had done some things that weren't good for it. I have a longer continuous association with them, 30 years, more than anybody else in the country. When we are properly cleared to each other, I can tell you more. What in the world was that? That was a real shocker. So I did a lot of digging, found somebody who knew Menzel. There was nothing in any of the newspapers or any place. 2 issues of Sky and Telescope devoted to Menzel. None of them mentioned his high-level security work for the government. That put a different slant on things. It turns out he was also a world-class cryptologist. NSA works with decoding stuff. He taught cryptology, mostly to women, because at the beginning of the war, they used women because the men were being drafted. This was highly classified, and they set up courses at the women's colleges around Harvard. It's a long, long story. I ran across a autobiography, unpublished, of Menzel. And those hearings were the worst experience of his life, he said. Well, suddenly, I didn't like Menzel when I started this. But then I appreciated how much he had done for the government, how he had kept a secret. Turns out he also wrote science fiction, under other names, mind you, because he didn't think that his astronomical colleagues would appreciate somebody writing science fiction. He was even offered the editorship of a science fiction magazine. So that cleared away. Everybody else suited this entirely. And I still have people telling me, oh, Stan, he couldn't have led a double life, which is what I said he did lead. Well, I would mention 3 English intelligence agencies: Burgess, Phillips, Philby, and McLean. They were English intelligence, but it turns out they were Russian spies for 15 years. That's leading a double life. Because you got to be careful that you don't, somebody doesn't figure out where did this information come from. So I've written a whole book about this, and I'm still doing battle with the people who refuse to go to Harvard, refuse to go to the archives, to dig. I believe you should have facts in hand before putting mouth in gear. That's my philosophy. So MJ-12, this is a memo from Truman to Forrestal, and there's all kinds of details. Dates that, how did anybody know were the correct dates? The only date in an 8-month period where Truman met with Forrestal, for example, in Van Bush. How did anybody know that? I asked the Truman Library whether anybody had asked about that. No. I found a memo, or my colleagues found a memo. It just mentions NSC MJ-12 Special Studies Project. And there's no signature. Robert Cutler was a special assistant to the president. And Mr. Philip J. Klass, one of the outstanding debunkers, senior avionics editor for Aviation Week and Space Technology, challenged me. Maybe you didn't notice that memo was done in the large pica type, he said, but the National Security Council used only elite type. I challenge you to find any genuine memos done in the same size and style type, and I'll pay you $100 each for every genuine done in pica as opposed to elite type. Well, that was interesting. I went to my files. I found 20 pages of pica type stuff, but they didn't all meet his criteria. So I was going back to the library, and dug out 14 done in the same size and style type, made copies. He offered me $100 each up to a maximum of 10. Damn, I could have made a lot of money. But I sent him the 14 and he paid me the $1,000. And then got angry, as you can imagine, when I published a copy of his check in my book. Proof positive. And I found out after this that he had never been to the Eisenhower Library. I spent weeks there. They have 250,000 pages of National Security Council material there. I used the NSC quite a lot. And he dared to suggest that it was all done in elite type. I mean, that typical of the intellectual bankruptcy of the pseudoscience of anti-ufology. I like the way that sounds, you know. Here's my book about it. And I'd sell you one, except I'm sold out. But there's some book lists on the table out there tomorrow. It was a challenge to dig in, because a lot of this stuff isn't available. People say, oh, you can just go to your computer, find all this stuff. The stuff at the Presidential Archives isn't scanned. You can't go to, you got to go there. And for many people, it's too much trouble. Oh, another book, Roswell Legacy, Jesse Marcel Jr. He died a couple of years ago. He was a doctor, medical doctor. He handled pieces of the wreckage when he was 11 years old. Jesse brought some home. And great guy. He was called back in at age 68. He was a helicopter pilot. He was a flight surgeon. And those were hard to come by. To fly helicopters in combat at age 68. He flew 225 hours. Some people have suggested maybe they were trying to get him killed so he couldn't testify anymore. I don't know. I was in his home. I was in his father's home. It's pretty special people, is what I'm saying. I was impressed. There's my crash at Corona. Corona's the town where the the crash actually occurred, not Roswell. But Corona's a tiny town. They loved me there. They had a marquee on the old movie theater. Forget about Roswell, it all happened here. So when my book came out with that title, they liked it. Recollection of Roswell, that's the testimony from 27 witnesses. All of whom, all of whom are dead. Sorry, but you can listen to them. Rules for debunkers, I won't go into it. I'll show you some quick pictures. That's Hawaii. I think the white stuff behind that is an air plasma related to a magneto-aerodynamic propulsion system. Solve all the problems of high-speed flight. Salt Lake City, Utah, that's the Mormon temple there at the bottom, lower right-hand corner. I was at the exact location where the photograph was taken by a professional photographer. Number 5, I think this is an ionized air plasma related to a magneto-aerodynamic propulsion system. This region here. Santa Ana, California. Talked to the guy who took the pictures. Worked for the state of California, incidentally. McMinnville, Oregon, I don't know what happened to this picture. It's much better than that, but it was one of the pictures that the Condon Committee couldn't identify as anything conventional. This is the island of Trindade off the coast of Brazil. Object comes in from the right, sharp turn, off, up and away. Pictures taken by a guy on board the official Navy ship. You can see these. It's the best one of the batch. The pictures were released to the public by the president of Brazil. I doubt if he released phony pictures intentionally to hoax the press. I mean, you know, there's an enlargement of that. Governments can't keep secrets. Well, except when they do. This is a CIA top secret document. And don't say scrape off the black. They send you Xeroxes. There's nothing underneath there. There's another one. Is that legal, somebody said to me? Yes, of course it's legal. You can't release classified information to people without clearances. Now, I don't know whether I have the NSA document. I love this comment on a CIA document. Deny in toto. You can't release one word on the page. No, I don't. The NSA document is all whited out instead of blacked out. One sentence you can read. Everything else is whited out. 156 pages. Very exciting reading. No, they can't do that. Well, they did do it. During 1952, the instructions to pilots, if they don't land, if a UFO doesn't land when you instruct it to do so, shoot it down. And as a matter of fact, there were 200 fatal plane crashes of American military planes over the United States. 5 of the pilots who were killed had over 100 missions in Korea, where there were MiGs trying to shoot them down, you know. And they come back to the United States, no MiGs, and 5 crashed. And the New York Times used words like disintegrated and disappeared. Strange words, you know, for military plane crashes. I have talked to 7 different ex-military guys who told me when they were at a certain base that a pilot went up after UFOs, chased them, never came back. And if I've heard of 7 cases, there got to be a lot more.